He took one bite and went completely still. The fork hovered in midair. His jaw stopped moving. Something crossed Nathan Calloway's face that no one on Red Cedar Ranch had seen in 8 years, something raw and unguarded and broken all at once. The new cook stood across the kitchen, watching him, not understanding what she had done. He set the fork down slowly. When he finally looked up, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Where did you learn to make this?" If you love stories about second chances and quiet courage, subscribe to this channel right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had exactly $11.40 in her coat pocket when the wagon dropped her at the front gate of Red Cedar Ranch. She did not count it again. There was no point. She knew the number, the way a person knows the depth of a wound, not because they keep measuring it, but because it never quite leaves their mind. $11.40. That was what remained after 4 years of cooking, cleaning, mending, hauling water, and carrying the weight of a grown man's failures on a frame that had never been built for all that punishment. She lifted her suitcase. It wasn't heavy. She'd made sure of that before she left Billings. Left behind the cracked dishes, the curtains her aunt had sewn before she died, the 3 dresses too worn to be worth saving. What she kept fit into one battered case, and a cloth-wrapped bundle tucked under her arm. The bundle was the only thing she had carried with both hands. Her grandmother's recipe journal. Clara was 28 years old, and she had learned by now that the world does not pause to ask a woman what she deserves. It only asks what she can do. So she straightened her back, picked up the suitcase, and walked toward the ranch house with the same expression she'd worn through every hard thing that had ever happened to her, calm on the outside, braced on the inside, and refusing to let either one show too much. The foreman who met her at the kitchen entrance was a leathery man named Walt Greer, somewhere past 60, with a gray mustache that seemed to express his opinions before he opened his mouth. He looked her over once, not unkindly, but with the particular efficiency of a man who had interviewed a dozen cooks before her and had no patience left for ones who couldn't handle the work. "You're the applicant from the Billings Post," he said. "Clara Whitmore." "Yes, sir." "You cook for large numbers before." "I kept a household of 12 ranch hands for 2 years in Cascade County. Before that, I worked the harvest season kitchen in Lewistown. 30 men, 3 meals a day, 6 days a week." Walt's mustache shifted slightly. "Mr. Calloway runs close to 40 hands through the summer season. Breakfast before first light, dinner at midday if we can manage it, supper before dark. You fall behind on any of those, the men work hungry and hungry men make mistakes." "I won't fall behind," Clara said. He studied her another moment. "Kitchen's in rough shape. Last cook we had quit 2 weeks ago without notice, left it in a state. I've worked in worse." Something about the way she said it, not as a complaint, simply as a fact, seemed to settle something for Walt Greer. He stepped back and held the door open. "I'll show you the stores," he said. "You start tomorrow morning, 4:30. Clara walked through the door. The kitchen was as Walt had promised in a state. Pots stacked without order. A flour barrel left open, drawing moisture from the summer air. 3 cast-iron skillets that hadn't been properly seasoned in what looked like months. A side of salt pork hanging near the window where the afternoon heat got to it. Clara moved through the space quietly, not saying anything, just looking the way her grandmother had taught her to look at any kitchen before touching a single thing. Understand it first, then fix it. She stayed up past midnight that first night, not cooking, just cleaning, organizing, taking stock of what was there and what was missing and what would need to be ordered before the end of the week. She wrapped the salt pork properly and moved it. She oiled the cast iron. She transferred the flour into the sealed tin she found in the back of a low cabinet, the kind of tin someone had bought with good intentions years ago and then forgotten about. She swept. She scrubbed. She laid out tomorrow's breakfast in her head, the way a general lays out a campaign, knowing what needed to come first, what could wait, and where there was no room for error. By the time she finally allowed herself to sit down, the kitchen was hers. Not legally, not permanently. but in the way that a space becomes yours when you have cleaned it with your own hands and decided to care for it. She opened her grandmother's recipe journal on the table and ran her fingers across the handwriting on the first page. To Clara, who will cook with love when I no longer can. Grandma rose. She closed it again. Not because it made her sad, because she was too tired to feel anything that large tonight, and she needed to save what she had for tomorrow. Breakfast the next morning told her everything she needed to know about the men she was feeding. They came in the dark before the sun had fully committed to rising, with the kind of quietness that belongs to people who have learned not to expect much. They found seats at the long tables, poured their own coffee without asking, and ate with their heads down, not from rudeness, but from habit. This was not a kitchen where anyone had spent time making them feel welcome. This was a place where food appeared, and you consumed it before the day demanded you move again. Clara had made biscuits. Not the hard, flat kind that had apparently been the previous cook's signature achievement, based on the leftover examples she'd found wrapped in cloth. Her biscuits were the kind her grandmother made tall, soft in the middle, with a crust that gave way when you pressed it. She'd made gravy from the drippings of the breakfast sausage, thick and peppered and honest. She'd scrambled eggs in the good skillet and kept them just barely firm, so they didn't turn rubbery before they reached the table. She watched from the kitchen doorway as the first pan of biscuits landed. She saw a man pick one up, bite into it, and stop. He nudged the man next to him with his elbow. Within 5 minutes, the room was different. Not loud, these were working men not given to outbursts at breakfast. But the quiet had changed quality. It was no longer the quiet of absence. It was the quiet of satisfaction. A young ranch hand, maybe 19, appeared in the kitchen doorway with an empty pan and an expression of naked hope. "Ma'am, are there more biscuits?" Clara pointed to the second pan keeping warm on the back of the stove. "There are always more biscuits," she said. "Tell the others." He turned and hollered it down the hallway with more enthusiasm than the occasion probably required. Clara allowed herself a small private smile and went back to work. She did not see Nathan Calloway that first morning. Walt had told her that the owner kept irregular hours out before most of the men back after most of them had eaten. He managed the ranch with the kind of absolute focus that left no room for anything as secondary as mealtimes. She heard about him, though. Ranch hands talk. Not always loudly, and not always directly, but a kitchen is a room where things get said, especially when the woman behind the stove is quiet enough that people forget to guard their words. Clara had learned years ago that listening carefully while doing something else with your hands was one of the most useful skills a person could develop. "Calloway ride the north fence again this morning," one of the older hands said over his noon meal. "Went out before I was up," said another. "Came back once to switch horses. That's all I saw of him." "Man works like he's running from something," a third voice offered, and then a brief silence fell over that end of the table, the kind that meant the observation had landed somewhere true, and everyone knew not to pull at it. Clara refilled the breadbasket on that end of the table and said nothing. By the second day, she had formed a picture of Nathan Calloway from what was not said about him. He was respected without being liked in the easy sense. He was fair without being warm. The men worked hard for him because he worked harder than any of them. And there was something under all that discipline, something the men stepped around carefully in conversation, the way you step around a board you know is loose in a floor, that had to do with a loss. So old, it had become part of the structure of the place. 8 years, Walt told her on the second afternoon when she asked directly. 8 years since Mrs. Calloway died. Childbirth. The baby, too. "He never speaks of it," Clara said. "Never," Walt said. "And we don't either." It was the fourth night when Nathan Calloway finally came through the kitchen door. Clara was alone finishing the prep for tomorrow's bread. She had the dough set for its overnight rise and was cleaning the table when she heard boots on the back step. Not the boots of any of the hands she'd already catalogued by sound, because she did pay that kind of attention, always had. These were deliberate, unhurried. the boots of a man who owned the ground under him and had never had reason to move quickly on his own property. She looked up. Nathan Calloway was taller than she'd imagined from the description, and leaner through the face, the kind of lean that comes from years of being outdoors rather than from not eating enough. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set in a particular expression and left there long enough to become permanent, and eyes the color of a sky just before a storm decides what it's going to do. He stopped when he saw her. She got the impression he had expected the kitchen to be empty. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I started Monday." "I know," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Even. Controlled in the way of a man who had spent decades deciding that's how his voice would be. "Walt told me." A brief pause. She had learned in 4 seconds that this was a man who did not fill silences as a courtesy. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I'll find something. There's stew left from supper. It'll take me 2 minutes to warm it." He looked at her. Just looked, and she had the odd sensation of being assessed the way he might assess a piece of land or a head of cattle, not unkindly, but thoroughly. She met it with the same steadiness she'd brought to everything else about this situation. "All right," he said. She warmed the stew. She cut bread. And because she had made it that afternoon while everything else was quiet, and she had the oven to herself, she sliced a piece of the blackberry pie she'd baked from page 37 of her grandmother's journal. She set it all in front of him without ceremony. He ate the stew first methodically, the way he probably did everything. She went back to her cleaning. Neither of them spoke. She had the sense that he was not a man who experienced silence as uncomfortable, and she was not a woman who felt the need to perform conversation for its own sake. So the quiet between them was simply quiet. Two people occupying the same space without friction. Then she heard it. The sound of a fork stopping. She turned around. Nathan Calloway was sitting completely motionless, his fork suspended over the half-eaten piece of pie. His face had done something she had no framework for. It had opened somehow in a way that his face clearly did not open. There was a look in his eyes that did not belong to a man sitting in a kitchen at 9 o'clock at night. It belonged somewhere else. Somewhere a long time ago. He set the fork down very carefully, as if setting it down quickly might break whatever was happening. When he looked up at her, his voice was different. Not soft exactly, but something in the control had slipped just a fraction. "Where did you learn to make this?" Clara set down her cloth. "My grandmother," she said. "She baked it every Sunday. It was her recipe." He was quiet for a long moment. "My wife used to make this pie," he said. "I haven't tasted it since—" He stopped, picked up the fork again, put it down. "I didn't think anyone else had the same recipe. Blackberry pie with a brown butter crust," Clara said quietly, "and a pinch of cardamom." He looked at her then with the particular look of a man hearing something said aloud that he thought lived only inside his own memory. "The cardamom," he said. "Half to her, half to the room, half to something she couldn't see." "Yes, sir." He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the fork and finished the piece of pie in silence. When he was done, he stood, brought his plate to the counter, without being asked a detail that Clara filed away without comment, and said, "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Good night, Mr. Calloway." He walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen that had been left to her to fix, and stared at the doorway where he had gone, and felt for the first time since arriving at Red Cedar Ranch that something had shifted in the foundation of this place. She couldn't have said what exactly. She only knew that a man had eaten a piece of pie and been briefly genuinely present in a way he apparently had not been in a very long time. She wrapped the remaining pie, extinguished the lamp, went to her room. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about her grandmother's handwriting on the first page of the journal. "Cook with love." She hadn't thought much about what that meant when she was young. She thought she understood it now. The following week moved with the specific rhythm of hard work, which is to say it moved both slowly and fast each hour, demanding full attention each day gone before she had accounted for all of it. Clara learned the ranch the way she learned any kitchen, by paying close attention and asking practical questions. She learned which hands had trouble with wheat and needed more cornbread. She learned that two of the younger men were barely eating because they'd arrived mid-season and felt awkward asking for more. She started leaving extra plates at their end of the table without drawing attention to it. She learned that Friday was the one evening when the men had the energy to linger after supper. So she started making something worth lingering for on Fridays, a cobbler or a proper cake, or her grandmother's honey-glazed bread that needed to be eaten warm. Word traveled as it does in enclosed communities. By the end of the second week, men were finishing their work with slightly more purpose on Friday afternoons. Walt Greer appeared in her kitchen doorway on a Thursday morning with an expression that suggested he was fighting something that might have been approval. "The men," he said, "are complaining less." "About the food," Clara said, not looking up from the pastry she was rolling. "About everything," Walt said. "It appears to be connected. People who've been fed well are harder to provoke," Clara said. "My grandmother used to say a hungry man and a cold man are the same man looking for someone to blame." Walt stood in the doorway another moment. "Where'd you say you were from?" "Originally Miles City, more recently everywhere." He nodded once as if this explained something he hadn't known he was puzzling over. Then he left. Clara smiled at her pastry. Chip time. Nathan Calloway came back to the kitchen on the seventh night. This time, she was not surprised. She had half expected it, not from arrogance, but from the simple observation that the kitchen had become in the past week the warmest room on the ranch. Not in temperature, in quality. She had put effort into making it a room worth being in, and she had noticed that people tend to drift toward warmth when they don't have to. He came in later this time, maybe 10 o'clock. She was sitting at the table with her grandmother's journal open, annotating a recipe she was planning to adapt for a larger quantity. He poured himself coffee from the pot she kept on the back of the stove through the evening. She had started doing it purely as a practical matter, but she was aware that it also meant there was always a reason to come through the kitchen, and sat down at the far end of the table, not across from her. The far end, distance that was respectful and also, she thought, instinctive. She did not look up immediately. He did not speak immediately. They occupied the silence for a minute or two, which felt natural rather than tense. Then he said, "That's a journal." "My grandmother's recipe collection," Clara said. "She kept it for 40 years. He looked at it from across the table. "She taught you to cook." "She taught me everything worth knowing," Clara said, "including what cooking is actually for." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "And what is it actually for?" Clara looked up at him then. He was watching her with the kind of attention that didn't quite match the casualness of the question. The attention of a man who had learned to ask things sideways because asking them directly had become too costly. "Keeping people alive," she said. "Not just their bodies. The part of them that knows they matter to someone." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at his coffee. "That's a considerable amount of responsibility for a cook," he said. "My grandmother never thought of herself as a cook," Clara said. "She thought of herself as someone who kept her family together. Cooking was just how she did it." Silence again. A different quality of silence than before. "I had 40 hands through the spring," Nathan said, still looking at his mug. "Lost 6 to Harrington's spread by May. Better offer, they said." A pause. "Walt thinks it had something to do with morale." "Walt's probably right." He looked up. "You've been here 2 weeks." "Yes, sir." "Men were talking at the south fence this afternoon, arguing about whether Friday's cobbler was better than the honey bread from last week." Something shifted briefly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The idea of one. That hasn't happened in a long time. What's happened instead? Arguing about wages, arguing about days off, arguing about each other. He set his mug down. Quieter kind of arguments. The kind that mean people have given up expecting things to be good. Clara said nothing. She understood that he was telling her something about more than the ranch hands. He stood up. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night, Mr. Calloway." He took 3 steps toward the door and stopped. Without turning around, he said, "The pie. Last week." "Yes." "It was—" He paused, seemed to decide something. "Thank you for making it." He left before she could respond. Clara sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, with her grandmother's journal open in front of her, and the quiet settling around her like something she could actually rest in. The second week became the third. The third week brought its own complications. The first was practical. Clara identified a pattern in the food stores that troubled her. The previous cook had been ordering well above what the ranch needed: flour, sugar, cured meat, and the discrepancy between what was ordered and what could be accounted for in the pantry was significant enough to mean one of two things. Either food was spoiling at a rate that suggested criminal carelessness, or someone had been siphoning supplies. She brought it to Walt quietly on a Wednesday morning, showing him the ledger she'd found in the pantry drawer and the inventory she'd taken herself. Walt looked at the numbers for a long time. "I'll handle it," he said. "I'm not accusing anyone," Clara said carefully. "I'm only saying that going forward I'd like to keep the ordering records myself." Walt looked at her. "You're asking me to give you more responsibility." "I'm asking for the authority to do the job properly," she said. "There's a difference." He handed her the ledger. The second complication arrived in the form of a letter delivered to the ranch on a Thursday, which Walt set on Nathan Calloway's desk, and which Clara knew nothing about, until the evening when Nathan came to the kitchen earlier than usual, with a set to his jaw that told her something had changed. He poured his coffee, sat at his usual end of the table. She waited. "You know Charles Hawthorne," he said. "I know of him," Clara said. "Hawthorne Cattle, south of here. He wants to merge operations, his spread and mine, consolidate the herds, share the water rights on the East River boundary." Nathan's voice was flat, factual, the voice he used for things he hadn't decided how to feel about. "His terms include a condition." Clara continued kneading the bread dough she'd been working. "What condition?" "He wants a marriage arrangement between his daughter Victoria and me." The kitchen was very quiet. "I see," Clara said. "It's a business proposal dressed as a personal one," Nathan said. "Or possibly a personal proposal dressed as a business one. Hawthorne's never been straightforward about the difference." "What does Victoria Hawthorne want?" Clara said. Nathan looked at her as if the question surprised him. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't spoken to her in 2 years." "That might be worth finding out before you consider the rest of it," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're not telling me to refuse." "It's not my place to tell you anything about it," Clara said. "I'm just noticing that the arrangement has 2 people in it, and you've only discussed one of them." He considered this. "Walt thinks I should accept," he said. "Hawthorne's water rights would solve the east boundary problem permanently. And if the summer goes as dry as the almanac suggests, then it becomes a practical question," Clara said. "Yes." She shaped the dough, set it to rise, washed her hands. "Mr. Calloway," she said without turning around, "how long have you been making decisions based only on what's practical?" A long silence. 8 years, he said. And the way he said it, the precise way, the honest way, without any attempt to make it sound like a choice, told her that he knew exactly what the question was actually asking. She heard him stand up. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night." She listened to his boots cross the floor and go out the back door, and she stood at the kitchen counter in the dark with her hands drying on her apron and the weight of someone else's grief pressing briefly against the inside of her chest. Not her own grief, but her recognition of it, which is its own kind of sorrow. The last thing that happened in the third week, Clara did not see coming. She had gone to Millhaven, the nearest town 7 miles east, with Walt on the supply run, which she'd begun making herself because it was the only way to ensure the correct things were ordered in the correct quantities. They were loading the wagon outside Morrison's general store when a voice behind her said her name. Not Miss Whitmore, not even Clara. Just her name in the tone of a man who felt he had a right to it. She turned. Her Uncle Roy Whitmore was standing on the board sidewalk, with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and an expression on his face that she had spent 4 years learning to brace against the expression of a man who believed that her existence was primarily useful to him. He had lost weight since she'd last seen him. His coat was dusty. He had not, she noted, with the precise attention she gave to things that mattered, come to Millhaven for any innocent reason. He had come specifically looking for her, which meant someone had told him where she was. "Clara," he said again, "you look well." "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Not Uncle. She had stopped that months ago." Roy Whitmore smiled. It was a smile she knew the way you know a crack in the floorboard exactly where it was, exactly how much weight it would bear before it gave. "I've been looking for you," he said. "We have things to discuss." "We don't," Clara said. "The Hargrove Orchard property," he said. "Your grandmother's deed. She left it in her estate, and her estate was left to me," Clara said. Her voice did not waver. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head many times in many forms, and she had learned that the only way through it was straight. "Entirely and specifically to me. I have the will. I have the deed. And I have my grandmother's journal, which she specifically documented as personal property." Roy's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "You're working on Calloway's ranch," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Interesting?" He let the word sit there. "A single woman, working in a rich man's kitchen, living on his property." Walt Greer had gone very still beside her. Clara met her uncle's eyes. "Say what you came to say," she said. "I came to say that there are things about your grandmother's estate that are more complicated than you've been told," Roy said. "And that walking away from your family to cook for a wealthy rancher doesn't make those complications disappear. Walking away from—" Clara stopped herself, took one breath. "I walked away from you, Roy, not from my family. You ceased to be my family when you sold grandmother's cattle to pay a gambling debt and told her they had died of fever." Silence on the sidewalk. Roy's jaw tightened. "You'll regret making this difficult," he said quietly. "I've already had everything difficult," Clara said. "I find I'm no longer frightened of it." She turned and helped Walt lift the last crate into the wagon. She could feel Roy Whitmore watching her all the way down the street. She did not look back, but her hands were not quite steady as she climbed up onto the wagon bench, and Walt Greer, who was not a demonstrative man in any respect, put the wagon into motion without saying a word, and let the 7 miles back to the ranch pass in a quiet that asked nothing of her, which was, she understood, its own kind of kindness. She did not tell Nathan about Roy Whitmore, not that night, not the next day. It was not his problem, and she was not in the habit of making her problems into other people's burdens. But Roy Whitmore was already moving. She would not know that until later. She would not know that he had spent those days in Millhaven talking to anyone who would listen, talking about his niece, about her grandmother's estate, about what it looked like when a young woman with nothing placed herself into a wealthy man's household and stayed close to the kitchen long after the cooking was done. She would not know until the 4th week, when one of the younger hands came into the kitchen for his midday meal with an expression on his face that was not his own expression, the expression of someone who has heard something and is not sure yet what to do with it. He looked at her across the kitchen counter, looked away, got his plate. She noted it without speaking. By the 4th day of the 4th week, there were 3 men who had adopted that expression. On the 5th day, a ranch hand named Denny, a reliable, good-natured man she'd come to count on for his honesty, stopped her near the well before breakfast. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I don't know who's been saying what in town. I don't know if it matters to you, but for what it's worth—" He looked uncomfortable, pressed forward anyway. "We know what kind of woman you are. Most of us do. And we know why this place is different than it was." Clara looked at him. "What are people saying in town?" she said. Denny shifted his weight. "That you've got designs on the ranch." The words landed without drama, because she had been halfway expecting something like them. "I see," she said. "I don't believe it," Denny said. "I wanted you to know that." "Thank you, Denny," she said. "I appreciate it." She went back to the kitchen and started breakfast. Her hands were completely steady. But something had begun. Something that had nothing to do with cooking, and everything to do with the fact that she had made the mistake perhaps of being too useful in a place where she had also become too visible. And her uncle had noticed. That night, Nathan came to the kitchen. He did not pour coffee immediately. He stood in the doorway in a way that told her he had heard something or noticed something and was deciding how to address it. She continued with her work. "There's talk," he said. "I know," she said. "It's coming from Millhaven." He said it directly. It was she had observed his way he could leave things unsaid for a long time and then say them without preamble. "My uncle," Clara said. "His name is Roy Whitmore. He arrived in town last week. He wants the deed to my grandmother's orchard property and her recipe journal, both of which she left specifically to me. Since I won't give them to him, he's decided to make my being here into something it isn't." Nathan was quiet. "Why does he want a recipe journal?" he said. "Because it contains documentation of her wishes regarding the estate," Clara said. "Notes, letters, records. My grandmother was meticulous. She knew Roy would contest the will, and she built a case against him inside her own recipe book." A pause. "She sounds like a formidable woman," Nathan said. "She was the most formidable person I've ever known," Clara said. "She also made extraordinary pie." There was a beat, and then something happened that she had not seen before in 3 weeks at Red Cedar Ranch. Nathan Calloway almost smiled. Not quite. The near thing of a smile, brief and imperfectly restrained, that told her there was something underneath all that controlled discipline that had a sense of humor still alive in it. He caught it and set his face back into order. "What do you intend to do about him?" Nathan said. "I intend to do what I've been doing," Clara said. "My job, correctly, and trust that the truth is more durable than a rumor." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not asking me to do anything about it," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." Another long pause. "Most people in your situation would ask," he said. "I'm not most people," Clara said. And then, because honesty felt more important than tact, "And I don't want to keep my job because my employer defended me out of obligation. If I'm going to keep it, I want to earn it." Nathan looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It was not admiration exactly. It was more like recognition, the particular look of a person who has encountered a quality they thought was rarer than it apparently is. He poured his coffee. He sat at his end of the table. They were quiet together for a long time, the way they had become quiet together over 3 weeks in a kitchen that Clara had made into something worth being in. And somewhere in that quiet, under the low burn of the lamp, with the journal on the table between them, and the cooling coffee, and the smell of the bread she'd set to rise, Nathan Calloway said with a matter-of-factness that did not quite disguise what was underneath it. "My wife's name was Ellen. She found that recipe, the pie recipe, in a church almanac from back east. She made it every Sunday for 5 years. Clara set down what she was holding. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Clara said. "She was," he said, quietly, simply, without the careful management he put around everything else. "She was the only person who ever made this house feel like the word meant what it's supposed to mean." He picked up his coffee. He did not say anything else. But the kitchen, which had already become the place on Red Cedar Ranch where the warmth lived, became something else that night as well. Became the place where something that had been sealed for 8 years had in the space of 1 sentence allowed a single crack of air. Clara did not press it. She had learned from her grandmother and from everything since that some things opened in their own time or not at all. She went back to her work. He finished his coffee. He said good night. And it was not until he was gone and the kitchen was quiet and the lamp was low that Clara Whitmore let herself feel the full weight of where she was in a house that had lost its sense of home. In a kitchen she had rebuilt from someone else's neglect. Cooking meals for 40 men with her grandmother's recipes and her grandmother's belief that feeding people was a way of telling them they mattered. She thought about Roy Whitmore on the sidewalk in Millhaven. She thought about the deed and the journal and what her grandmother had understood when she placed them both in Clara's hands. She thought about a man who had just said his dead wife's name aloud for what might have been the first time in years over a cup of coffee in a kitchen that 3 weeks ago had been a room nobody wanted to be in. She opened the journal to page 37. The recipe was written in her grandmother's careful, unhurried hand. Blackberry pie with brown butter crust. And at the bottom in smaller writing, almost like a note to herself, for the ones who have forgotten they deserve sweetness. Clara pressed her hand flat against the page. Then she closed the journal, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. And tomorrow, the way it always did, would ask everything of her. And the way it always had, she would be ready. The morning after Nathan said his dead wife's name aloud in Clara's kitchen, he arrived at breakfast before the rest of the men. Not unusual for him, Walt had told her on her first week that Nathan Calloway had not slept past 5 in the morning since the year his wife died. But this morning was different. He did not come through the back door in motion the way he usually did, already carrying the momentum of a man with 17 things decided before sunrise. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the table, looked at her. Then he sat down. Clara set coffee in front of him without being asked the way she'd started doing somewhere in the second week, and he accepted it the way he'd started accepting it without comment, but also without the particular stiffness of a man uncomfortable with being anticipated. She went back to the stove. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "I spoke out of turn last night," he said. She turned. He was looking at the table. "You didn't," she said. "I said things that aren't." He paused, worked through something. "This is a working relationship, Miss Whitmore. I don't want to have made it uncomfortable." Clara looked at him steadily. "Mr. Calloway, you mentioned your wife's name and that she made good pie. You didn't say anything that made me uncomfortable. You said something that made you human. There's a difference." He looked up at her. Then, with an expression she was starting to recognize, the expression of a man who had been presented with a plain truth and was deciding whether to argue with it or let it stand. He let it stand. He drank his coffee. The men came in by 5s and 10s, and the kitchen filled with the sounds of a working morning, and whatever had passed between them folded itself back into the ordinary texture of the day. But it did not disappear. Clara had been paying close attention to things that did not disappear, and she knew the difference. The fourth week of summer brought heat that had teeth in it. Not the dry, clean heat of early July, but the heavy, mean kind that settled into the afternoon and refused to lift, the kind that made horses short-tempered and men sharp with each other, and work feel like twice the effort for half the result. By midweek, 3 of the older hands had gone home sick too, with heat exhaustion, and one with something that had started in his chest and was working its way toward serious. Clara adjusted. She had learned in her years of feeding people under difficult conditions that heat changes everything about food: what people can stomach, what gives them energy, what makes the difference between a man who makes it through the afternoon and a man who doesn't. She shifted the midday meal to lighter fare, cold-cured meat, pickled vegetables from the stores she'd been building since her second-week bread, made with less density and more salt, and a cold, sweet tea she started keeping in the cellar for anyone who needed it between meals. She started sending a boy out with a canvas bucket and ladles at 2 in the afternoon to wherever the hands were working. The first day she did it, Walt appeared in the kitchen doorway that evening. "The cold tea," he said. "Yes. Whose idea was that?" "Mine," Clara said. "Is it a problem?" Walt considered it. "No," he said. "No, it's not a problem." He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more frequently, with the quiet, honest evaluation of a man who is revising his initial estimate. "It's just that nobody's done that before." "Done what?" "Thought about the men in the afternoon." Clara set down the jar she was sealing. "The afternoon is the hardest part of the day," she said. "It's when people feel the most alone in the work. If I can make it 2 minutes easier, that seems worth the effort." Walt nodded. Once. Slowly. Then, "I'll make sure the boy knows which fields to cover first." He left. Clara went back to her preserving. She did not think of it as anything significant. Her grandmother had taught her that the small things are the ones that hold people together, not the grand gestures, not the exceptional occasions, but the small things repeated consistently until they become the shape of how a place feels. The cold tea in the afternoon, the extra biscuits, the Friday cobbler, the coffee kept warm until 10 o'clock in case someone needed it. These were not remarkable acts. They were simply acts of attention. And attention given freely and without expectation has a cumulative weight that eventually changes the character of a room, or a ranch, or a life. On Thursday of the 4th week, Victoria Hawthorne arrived at Red Cedar Ranch. Clara heard about it from Denny, who appeared in the kitchen at 11 with the information delivered in the tone of a man who had come to warn someone. "Miss Hawthorne's in the parlor," he said, arrived with her father's buggy and 2 men. "Walt's gone to find Mr. Calloway." Clara nodded and went back to the bread she was shaping. "You don't seem surprised," Denny said. "I'm not," she said. "Hand me that towel." He handed it to her and lingered in that way he had when there was more he wanted to say. She's very—" Denny stopped. Tried again. "She's not what you'd call a woman who doesn't make an impression." "Most women with resources and confidence tend not to be," Clara said. "She asked Walt who the cook was," Denny said. "He told her. She asked if you were— she asked about the—" He was struggling with the diplomatic version of something that did not have one. "She asked if you were pretty." Clara looked up at him. "And Walt said," she asked. Denny's ears went red. "Walt said you were competent." He said it like it was the highest compliment available to a person. "It is," Clara said. "Go on, Denny. You've got work." He went. Clara formed the loaves, set them to proof, washed her hands. She told herself that Victoria Hawthorne's presence on the ranch was not her concern, because it wasn't. She told herself that a business arrangement between 2 families of means, brokered by a wealthy cattle baron and sealed by a practical marriage, was exactly the kind of thing that happened every day in Montana Territory, and that it had nothing whatsoever to do with her. She believed this almost completely. She also kept one ear turned toward the parlor for the next 2 hours, which was the only honest thing to admit about the rest of that morning. Nathan found her after lunch. He came into the kitchen while she was alone mid-afternoon doing the kind of quiet preparatory work that fills the space between the midday meal and supper. She could tell by the quality of his silence that the meeting had not gone the way anyone had planned. "She's gone," Clara said. "She and her father both," he said. He sat down at the table, didn't reach for the coffee. "Hawthorne wants an answer by the end of August." "That's 3 weeks," Clara said. "Yes." She continued with her work. He sat with whatever was on his mind, which was apparently substantial. "Victoria Hawthorne is 26 years old," he said finally. "She's educated. She manages her father's household accounts, and has for the past 4 years since her mother died. He paused. "She's perfectly capable." "That sounds like a description of a business partner," Clara said. "It is," he said. And then, with the bluntness of a man who had stopped bothering to pretend, "She looked at this ranch the way I look at a new head of cattle. She was valuing it." Clara said nothing. "She looked at me the same way," Nathan said. Flat. Without self-pity, because he was not capable of that particular emotion. Just honest. "I can't fault her for it. It's the same arrangement I'm being asked to consider." "What did she say?" Clara asked. Directly. What did she actually say? He was quiet for a moment. "She said she thought the property had significant potential, and that she believed a managed partnership could be mutually beneficial." He said it without inflection, which was its own inflection. Those were her words. Managed partnership. "And you," Clara said. He looked at her. "I said I would give Hawthorne my answer before August ended." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara let the silence work, because she had learned that Nathan Calloway did not need to be prompted. He needed to be given space that didn't demand anything of him, and he would move toward truth on his own. She's a capable woman, he said again, and she would run this ranch efficiently, and Hawthorne's water rights on the east boundary are worth... He stopped, set his hands flat on the table. My investors are already asking questions about the summer's numbers. If the drought stretches another 6 weeks, I'll be selling cattle at a loss to make payroll. So the merger makes sense, Clara said. Financially, yes. And otherwise, he looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not pain exactly, but the memory of where pain had been, which is its own kind of weight. Ellen used to say, he began and then stopped. Clara went very still. He didn't look away. She used to say that the only thing worse than a hard life is a life you didn't choose to live. He looked down at his hands. She chose everything, including me, which I thought was her worst decision. The edge of something grief, or the memory of happiness, or the place where both of them used to be, moved through his voice. She'd have an opinion about this situation. What do you think she'd say? Clara asked quietly. He almost smiled, the ghost of it. She'd say I was using money to avoid the actual question. Silence. Was she right about most things? Clara said. About everything that mattered, he said. Clara turned back to the counter. Her hands were doing their work, and she kept her voice even because this was not a moment that needed anything dramatic from her. The actual question, she said. The one you're avoiding. What is it? He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet and direct and completely unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before. Whether I'm capable of wanting anything again, he said, beyond what the ranch needs. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara turned around. He was looking at the table, not at her, and she was glad of it, because she needed a moment to assemble her face into something that did not say more than she intended. You are, she said simply. People who are no longer capable of wanting things don't ask the question. He looked up. She went back to her work. He sat at the table for another 10 minutes, and then he stood, and he said goodnight, even though it was 4 p.m, and she said goodnight back, and neither of them commented on the fact that the sun was still well above the horizon. The next morning 2 things happened before breakfast was on the table. The first was that Roy Whitmore rode onto Red Cedar Ranch. Clara was at the stove when she heard the commotion in the yard. Not an unusual sound for a working ranch, but there was something about this particular noise that made her put down the spoon and move to where she could see out the window without being seen herself. Roy was on horseback, which surprised her. She hadn't thought he had the means for a horse this month. He was speaking to one of the hands near the gate with an expression she recognized the performance of reasonableness that her uncle wore when he was about to do something unreasonable. Walt intercepted him before he got to the house. She watched them speak. Roy gesturing, Walt not moving. The particular stillness of a man who has decided that the person in front of him will not be allowed to pass. Roy left. But he left slowly, which meant he had done what he came to do, which was to be seen. To establish for anyone watching that he had a reason to be here. That there was a relationship between himself and Clara that gave him standing. Walt came into the kitchen 5 minutes later. Your uncle, Walt said. Yes. He says he needs to discuss estate matters with you. He doesn't, Clara said. He needs to establish that he has a claim on something. What he does here serves that purpose whether I speak to him or not. Walt looked at her. You've dealt with men like him before. I lived with one for 4 years, she said. I know every move in the pattern. Walt's jaw worked. I turned him away. But he'll be back. He'll be back, Clara agreed. What's the second thing? Walt blinked. Second thing. You came in here with 2 things on your face, Clara said. You told me the first. What's the second? Walt looked at her for a long moment with that expression she'd become familiar with, the expression of a man recalibrating how much intelligence was in the room with him. Hawthorne sent a formal letter this morning, he said. Delivered by messenger before 6. He's moved his deadline up. He wants an answer from Mr. Calloway by the end of next week. Clara set down the pan she was holding. Carefully. She set it down the way you set down something fragile when you realize you've been gripping it too hard. "Why?" she said. "The letter says he's received another offer for the water rights," Walt said, "from a mining operation out of Helena. He's giving Nathan first option out of professional courtesy. And if Nathan says no, he sells to the mining company. Their terms would put a sluice operation on the East River boundary that would reduce the water flow to Callaway land by—" Walt paused. "Significantly." Clara looked at him. "How significantly?" "Enough to lose a third of the summer grazing by next year," Walt said. "Maybe more, depending on the season." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a problem that did not have a comfortable solution. "He has to marry her," Clara said. It was not a question. "From a land and water standpoint," Walt said carefully, "it's the only move that preserves the ranch as it stands." Clara nodded once, turned back to the stove. "Breakfast," she said, "before the men come in." Walt stood there another moment. "Miss Whitmore." "Walt," she said gently but firmly. "Breakfast." He left. Clara stood at the stove and let the information settle into her the way cold water settles, shocking at first, then just the temperature of things. She had known from the beginning that she was here to cook. That was the job. The job had always been exactly the job, and nothing else. And she had been careful. She had been careful to keep it that way in all the ways that mattered. If the thing between herself and Nathan Callaway had become something she allowed herself to feel in the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night when the rest of the ranch was asleep, that was her own business. And she had learned long ago that feelings you do not act on, feelings you hold quietly, and do not inflict on anyone else, belong only to you and cost only you. And that was a cost she had paid before and could pay again. She cracked eggs into the pan. She made breakfast. 40 men came and ate and went back to work. And Nathan Callaway came through the kitchen at 7 in the morning with the look of a man who had read Hawthorne's letter at dawn and had not yet found a way to think about it that didn't cost him something. And she handed him coffee and said nothing at all because there was nothing to say, and he drank it standing at the counter and then went out to run his ranch because that was what he did. And she went back to her work because that was what she did, and the kitchen held all of it without breaking, which was, she thought, what a good kitchen was supposed to do. Chapter 10. The week that followed was the hardest she'd had at Red Cedar Ranch. Not because anything happened dramatically, but because everything happened quietly and relentlessly and at the same time. Roy Whitmore appeared in Millhaven and began talking. She heard about it in pieces, the way you hear about something that is being said about you in a place where you are not, through the expression on a stranger's face when Walt introduced her at the feed store, through the way a conversation in the bunkhouse stopped 2 beats too soon, when she walked past, through the careful non-comment of men who had made up their minds not to take sides but whose neutrality itself said something. The story Roy was telling was not a complicated one. Simple stories spread the fastest. He was telling anyone who would listen that his niece had inserted herself into a wealthy man's household with intentions that had nothing to do with cooking, that she had isolated herself with the ranch owner, that the business of the dead wife's recipe was not a coincidence, but a calculated move. He was good at telling it. He had always been good at this particular thing, taking a truth and rotating it just far enough that it meant something different. Clara did not respond publicly. She went to work every day. She made the meals. She managed the stores. She sent the cold tea out to the fields in the afternoon. She kept the coffee warm until 10. She baked the Friday cobbler and the Wednesday bread and the Sunday pie, the blackberry pie page, 37 every Sunday, because it had become the rhythm of the week, and she would not let Roy Whitmore take a rhythm from her. But she watched. She watched Nathan at breakfast, and she could see the calculation working behind his eyes, the drought numbers, the water rights, the letter from Hawthorne, the pressure from the investors he mentioned obliquely on Tuesday evening. She watched him weigh things the way a man who has never had the luxury of acting on feeling weighs everything in terms of what it costs and who it costs and what remains when the accounting is done. She watched him look at her once, just once on Wednesday night in the kitchen. Look at her with the expression of a man who is deciding something and wishes the decision were different, and she turned back to the stove before either of them had to account for it. On Friday, 3 of the hands who had been with the ranch longest came to her after supper. Tom Briggs, who'd been with Calloway 7 years, Pete Alderman, who'd been there since the year Ellen died, and Hank Morse, who was 61 years old and had the kind of face that suggested he had seen a significant percentage of everything worth seeing. They stood in the kitchen doorway, hats in hand, with the particular sheepishness of men who have decided to do something that does not come naturally to them. "Miss Whitmore," Tom started. "We want to say something." "Say it," Clara said. "What your uncle's been saying in town," Pete said. "It isn't right, and we think it ought to be said somewhere that matters that it isn't right." Clara looked at them. "What your uncle has people thinking," Hank said, with the directness of a man who had decided the diplomatic version was taking too long, "is that you've been running some kind of scheme. And anyone who's worked this ranch the past month knows that what you've actually been doing is holding the place together with both hands while Mr. Calloway holds the business end together with both of his." He paused. "We thought you should know that." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That means a great deal." "We also thought," Tom said, "that someone ought to tell Mr. Calloway what's being said, if he doesn't already know." "He knows," Clara said. "Does he know how far it's spread?" She paused. "I'm not sure." The 3 men exchanged a look. "We'll tell him," Pete said. "You don't need to do that," Clara said. "We know we don't need to," Hank said. "That's not really the point, is it?" They put their hats back on and went. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after they'd gone, with the particular feeling of being held up by people she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, and found that it was one of the more disorienting feelings available to a woman who had spent years making sure she didn't need anyone. Nathan came to the kitchen that night later than usual. She had almost given up on him when she heard the back door. He came in and stood for a moment before he spoke, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had already had the conversation with Tom and Pete and Hank. "Tom told me," he said. "I know," she said. He moved to the table, did not sit, stood with his hands braced on the back of the chair and looked at her directly. "I should have addressed this sooner," he said. "You've had a great deal to address," Clara said. "That's not an excuse," he said. The directness of it was not aggressive. It was the directness of a man who held himself to account and applied the same standard without softening it. "What your uncle is doing, what he's saying, it's affecting your ability to work here without being questioned. That's not acceptable. Not on my ranch." Clara set down the jar she'd been sealing and turned to face him. "What are you planning to do?" she said. "I'm going to Mill Haven tomorrow morning," he said. "I'm going to find Roy Whitmore and tell him that if he continues to spread rumors about any employee of Red Cedar Ranch, I'll pursue it legally." Clara looked at him. "That will give people more to say." "Let them say it," Nathan said. And there was something in his voice, something she hadn't heard in quite that form before, that was neither the rancher, nor the widower, nor the disciplined businessman. It was something simpler and older, and considerably more direct. "I don't particularly care what Charles Hawthorne thinks, or what Roy Whitmore tells people in Millhaven saloons. What I care about is whether the people on this ranch are treated with basic respect. And you are on this ranch." Clara held his gaze. "You still haven't decided about Hawthorne?" she said quietly. "No," he said. "Then don't do anything that makes that decision more complicated," she said, "for anyone." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had been cataloging for weeks and still couldn't fully name. It was not frustration. It was not longing exactly. It was the expression of a man who had found himself in a situation that he had not constructed and could not simply manage his way out of. "You're telling me to protect my business interests," he said. "I'm telling you to think clearly," she said, "which is apparently more than anyone else is doing." A long pause. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, Something in the kitchen shifted. Both of them felt it. Neither of them moved. She waited. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. "I'll think clearly," he said. "You have my word on that." A pause. "But I'm still going to Millhaven." He went out the door. Clara stood in the kitchen and let out a slow breath and decided that she would not examine what she felt right now, because there was bread to finish and a ranch to feed in the morning, and some feelings were better examined in daylight when you could see them clearly, rather than in a lamplit kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, when everything felt larger than it probably was. She told herself this several times. It helped a little. Check. He went to Millhaven the next morning. She didn't ask what happened. She could tell from the way he came back, not softened, but settled, the way a man looks when he has said something that needed to be said and has no regrets about it, that whatever he'd said to Roy Whitmore had been direct and had landed. Roy Whitmore did not come to the ranch again that week. But 2 days later, a piece of paper appeared under the door of Clara's room in the early morning. She found it before 4 o'clock, before the house was awake. She read it by lamplight sitting on the edge of her bed and felt the cold come up through her feet and into her chest, the way cold does when it finds something to hold on to. It was not signed. The handwriting was not Roy's. Roy had never been careful enough with his penmanship for anything this precise. It was a legal notice, or the imitation of one asserting that the estate of Rose Whitmore, late of Miles City, was under dispute, and that property claimed by Clara Ann Whitmore, including documents and personal effects, was subject to a counterclaim filed in the Cascade County Territorial Court. She read it twice. Then she opened her grandmother's journal to the back pages. Her grandmother had known. Of course, she had known. Rose Whitmore had spent 40 years navigating the particular difficulties of being a woman with property and a family that included Roy, and she had not been remotely naive about what would happen after she was gone. In the back of the recipe journal behind a recipe for apple butter that Clara had never tried to make, her grandmother had placed 3 folded pages. Clara had found them her first week at the ranch and read them, and then placed them back because they had seemed at the time like something to be held in reserve. They were not reserve material anymore. The first was a signed letter from Rose Whitmore's attorney in Miles City, attesting that the journal and its contents, including all recipes, notes, and accompanying documents, were the personal property of Clara Ann Whitmore, transferred directly by will and not subject to any estate dispute. The second was a copy of the will itself, with the relevant sections underlined in her grandmother's hand. The third was a list of every item Roy had sold or attempted to sell from the estate without legal authority, written in her grandmother's meticulous handwriting, with dates and amounts and names of buyers, the kind of documentation that a woman builds when she has decided that the truth needs to be able to defend itself. Clara sat in the early morning with these 3 pages in her hands and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not relief, not triumph, but the quiet, bone-deep gratitude of a person who has been protected by someone they love across a distance they can't close anymore. "You knew," she said quietly to the empty room, to the woman who had written "Cook with Love" on the first page of a book she left behind her. "You always knew." She folded the pages back into place, closed the journal, held it against her chest for a moment. Then she got up and went to make breakfast, because 40 men were about to be hungry, and the ranch did not pause for grief or gratitude or anything else, and her grandmother, who had understood what it meant to keep going, would have been the first one to tell her so. She told Nathan that evening. Not everything. Not the feeling of finding those pages in the dark before 4 o'clock. But the substance of it, the counterclaim, the forged notice, and what her grandmother had placed in the journal to answer it. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "You've had this documentation the whole time." "Yes," she said. "You didn't mention it. It wasn't relevant until now," she said. "I hoped it wouldn't become relevant." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Roy Whitmore filed a fraudulent legal notice. "What he filed is either fraudulent or will not survive any serious scrutiny," Clara said. "My grandmother's attorney is still practicing in Miles City. He has the original documents." "I'll send a letter tomorrow," Nathan said. to the attorney, and to the county court. "Mr. Calloway, on your behalf," he said. And he said it with a finality that told her the sentence was complete and the decision was not open for renegotiation. Not because you can't handle this yourself, you clearly can, but because you shouldn't have to handle it alone while you're working here, and because... He stopped, reorganized. "Because it's the right thing to do." Clara looked at him. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. He looked back at her for a long moment, and she thought he might deflect, might fold it back into practical terms, might find the responsible managerial language for what was actually a personal decision. He didn't. "Because your grandmother left you something worth protecting," he said. "And because the kind of person who would spend the last years of their life carefully documenting the truth so that the people she loved could be defended after she was gone." He stopped. "That deserves better than what your uncle is doing with it." Clara held very still. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Nathan said quietly. "She would have liked you," Clara said, and because she meant it completely and had no reason not to say so. She respected people who did difficult things without making a performance of it. He almost smiled. The near thing of it. He was getting more comfortable with the near thing. He stood up. "I'll write the letters tonight," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. He picked up his hat, paused. "Clara," he said, her name again deliberate. "The Hawthorne decision." She waited. "I have until the end of next week," he said. "I want you to know that I'm aware of everything that decision involves." She looked at him steadily. "Everything." He held her gaze for a long moment, and the kitchen held the weight of what both of them understood, without either of them saying it, and the lamp burned low, and outside the ranch settled into night around them. "Everything," he said. He put on his hat and walked out, and Clara stood in this kitchen that she had made into something worth being in, with her grandmother's journal on the table, and the letters Nathan was going to write, and the decision that was coming, and everything it would mean, and she understood something with the particular clarity of someone who has lived long enough to know when they are standing in a moment that will not repeat. She understood that the next week would change everything. She also understood that she would make breakfast at 4:30 in the morning regardless. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed. And she did not let herself hope for anything specific, because she was her grandmother's granddaughter, and her grandmother had taught her that hope and work are the same thing dressed differently, and work at least you could always get up and do. The letters went out Monday morning. Nathan wrote them himself by hand at his desk before the sun came up. 2 letters, one to the Miles City attorney and one to the Cascade County Territorial Court, both laying out the documentation Clara possessed and formally contesting any counterclaim filed by Roy Whitmore against the estate of Rose Whitmore. He did not ask Clara to review them before he sealed them. He brought them to the kitchen at 4:15, before she had the first pan on the stove, and set them on the corner of the table. "I'd like you to read these before Walt takes them to the post," he said. She dried her hands and read them. They were precise, thorough, written with the kind of language that leaves no room for interpretation and no opening for a man like Roy Whitmore to find purchase. The kind of letters that take practice to write, or a particular quality of mind that does not permit itself the luxury of vagueness. "This is more than I asked for," she said. "It's what the situation requires," he said. She folded them and handed them back. "Thank you." He picked them up and started for the door. "Nathan," she said. He stopped, turned. She had used his given name without thinking, and they both registered it at the same moment the first time she had done so. Something shifted briefly in his expression, like a door opening an inch. "The attorney's name is Harold Birch," she said. "He's been in Miles City for 30 years. He'll know the documents are authentic the moment he sees the handwriting." Nathan nodded once. "I'll add that to the cover letter." He went. Clara turned back to the stove and told herself the warmth she felt had to do with the fire. But by Tuesday, the drought had reached the kind of severity that changes the math on everything. Walt brought Nathan the numbers at noon water levels in the East River, down another 8 inches since Friday, The north pasture grazing compromised 2 sections of fence on the dry creek bed that needed to be moved, or the cattle would work them down, looking for water that wasn't there anymore. Nathan listened to all of it with the stillness of a man absorbing information he already half knew, and then he went out to the north pasture himself and didn't come back until after dark. Clara kept supper warm. He came in at 9 o'clock with dust on his jacket and the kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the weight of sustained responsibility. He sat at the table. She set food in front of him without ceremony. He ate without speaking, and she let the silence be what it needed to be, which was simply room for a man to eat and breathe and not have to perform competence for anyone. When the plate was empty, he said, "If this continues another 3 weeks, I'll be selling the South herd at whatever price I can get." "How much of a loss?" she said. He looked at her. Not surprised that she asked, she had learned that he had stopped being surprised by the practical range of her attention sometime in the 3rd week. "Enough to matter," he said. "Enough that the summer won't recover from it." "And Hawthorne's water rights," she said, "would eliminate the problem entirely," he said, flatly, as a fact. "The East River access his land controls feeds 3 of my best grazing sections. If I had legal access to it." "The ranch survives the drought," she said. "The ranch survives the drought," he said. The sentence sat between them, containing everything it contained. "How long do you have?" she said. "Hawthorne wants an answer Friday," he said. He moved it again. That was 3 days. "He moved it twice," Clara said. "He's nervous about something." Nathan looked at her. "What do you mean?" "A man who holds the strong hand doesn't keep changing the deadline," she said. "He sets it once and waits. Hawthorne's moved his deadline twice in 2 weeks. Either the mining company offer isn't as solid as he says, or there's something about this merger he needs more than he's letting on." Nathan was quiet for a moment, thinking. "His daughter," he said slowly. "Tell me about Victoria Hawthorne," Clara said. "Not what she said when she was here. What you know about her situation." He set his fork down. "Charles Hawthorne has no sons. Victoria runs the household accounts and has for 4 years, you know this. But she's 26 and unmarried, and in the territory that means Hawthorne's operation has a succession problem. If he dies without a son-in-law to inherit the ranch, goes into probate, and the creditors—" He stopped. "He has creditors." "How do you know?" Clara said. "Because I have the same bank," Nathan said. "And bankers talk to each other in the ways they're not supposed to." Clara looked at him steadily. "Charles Hawthorne needs this merger more than you do." Nathan sat with that. "The water rights," he said. "He'd still pull them if I say no." "Would he?" Clara said. "Think about what he actually needs. He needs his daughter settled. He needs the succession secured. Selling the water rights to a mining company helps his short-term cash position, but destroys his long-term leverage. He's a landman. He thinks in decades." She paused. "He's bluffing." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not admiration exactly, but the sharp, clear-eyed recognition of a man who has just been handed a piece of information that reorders everything. "You got all of that from a moving deadline," he said. "I got all of that from watching men manage pressure for 4 years," she said. "My uncle was broke for most of the time I lived with him. A man managing a weak position from the outside looks a particular way. Hawthorne looks that way." Nathan stood up. He moved to the window, not to look at anything she understood, but because he was the kind of man who needed to be in motion when he was thinking through something significant. "If I go to Millhaven and meet with Hawthorne directly," he said, "without a prior commitment, without telegraphing that I need the water rights, just as a conversation between neighboring ranchers, you'd know within 20 minutes how much pressure he's actually under," Clara said. He turned around and looked at her. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "My grandmother would have said I should have been whatever room I was standing in," Clara said. She thought the point was to be useful to the situation. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something crossed his face, something that had been working its way toward the surface for weeks. She thought something he had been managing and containing the way he managed and contained most things. It didn't quite break through, but it was visible now in a way it hadn't been before, like a light behind glass. "I'm going to Mill Haven tomorrow," he said, "to see Hawthorne." "Before you answer him formally," she said. "Not a question." "Before I answer him anything," he said. He picked up his hat. "Clara," he said. Her name the way he'd started saying it, deliberate like it mattered what he called her. "Yes." "Whatever happens with Hawthorne," he said, "I want you to know that it's not the only consideration." She looked at him steadily, kept her voice level. "I know," she said. He nodded once. He went. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed with the cooling supper plates and the low lamp and the weight of Friday coming, and let herself feel just for a moment, just in the honest privacy of a room where no one was watching, what it was like to be the consideration that mattered. Then she washed the plates and went to bed. Wednesday morning detonated before breakfast was on the table. Clara heard raised voices in the yard at 4:45. Not the normal pre-dawn sounds of a working ranch starting its day, but something harder-edged and specific. She stepped to the window. Walt was in the yard with two men she didn't recognize. Both on horseback, and the conversation had the posture of something that was not going to resolve politely. She went to find Nathan. He was already dressed. She suspected he'd been up for hours, and he passed her in the hallway, moving toward the front door with the focused walk of a man who had already assessed the situation from the upstairs window. "Stay in," he said as he passed. She didn't stay in. She stood at the kitchen window and watched. The two men on horseback were from Hawthorne's spread, she could tell from the brand on the near horse. They were not delivering a letter. Their hands were at ease, but not relaxed, and the difference between those two things was something Clara had learned to read in 4 years of living with a man who could smile while calculating damage. Nathan walked into the yard, and the conversation shifted immediately. Hawthorne's men redirecting to him with the particular adjustment of people who had been making progress with a lesser authority and suddenly found themselves facing the actual one. She couldn't hear the words, she could read the shape of it. One of the men produced a document. Nathan took it, read it. His face gave nothing. He said something short. The men exchanged a look. Nathan said something else, also short. The second man on horseback shifted his weight, and the first one reached for the document, but Nathan folded it and put it in his coat pocket with a finality that ended that particular attempt. The men left. Nathan came back through the kitchen door, unfolded the document, and set it on the table in front of Clara without preamble. She read it. It was a formal notice from Hawthorne Cattle Company, asserting that in the absence of a response from Nathan Calloway by noon Thursday, not Friday, noon Thursday, the water rights to the East River boundary would be transferred to the Helena Mining Consortium, effective immediately, tomorrow noon. "He moved it again," Clara said. "He moved it again," Nathan said. She looked up. "He's panicking." "Yes," Nathan said. "But a panicking man with water rights is still a man with water rights." He pulled out a chair and sat down. For the first time since she'd known him, he sat the way a man sits when he doesn't know what to do. Not the contained stillness of calculated patience, but the actual stillness of someone who has run out of obvious moves. "If he transfers to the mining company by tomorrow noon, I lose the east access permanently. The legal challenge would take 2 years minimum, and the damage to the grazing land in that time, you'd lose the ranch," Clara said quietly. He looked at her. "I'd lose a significant portion of what makes it viable." "Can you meet with Hawthorne today? This morning?" "I sent Walt to ask for a meeting the moment I saw the horses," he said. "Walt's riding out now." "And if Hawthorne refuses," Nathan's jaw worked, "then I have until tomorrow noon to either accept the marriage arrangement or start restructuring what I can afford to keep." Clara sat down across from him. Not at the far end of the table. Across from him. He looked at her for a moment, as if registering the geography of it. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Tell me about it," she said. "Not the numbers. The ranch. What it took to build it. What Ellen thought of it when you first started." He stared at her. "Clara, I don't see what—" "Tell me," she said quietly. "There's nothing to do until Walt comes back. Tell me." A long moment passed. Then something in him settled. The way she'd seen him settle over weeks in the kitchen at night, the letting go of the performance of composure, and the arrival of something more honest underneath it. "When I bought this land," he said slowly, "it was nothing, not even a proper house. Just 3 sections of grass and a creek, and the idea that cattle could make a life here if you were willing to work harder than the land made sense." He paused. "Ellen came out here 6 months after we married. She stood in the middle of what was going to be the kitchen, and she looked at the walls, bare boards, no plaster, no proper floor, and she said, 'This is going to be beautiful.'" His voice changed on the last sentence, changed quality. "She meant it. She wasn't managing me or being kind. She meant it the way she meant everything completely without reservation." He was quiet. "She was the only person I've ever known who looked at something unfinished and saw what it was actually going to become." Clara held very still. "She sounds like a woman who understood what love was for," she said. "She did," he said, simply, without the careful management. "She used to say love isn't for the good times. Anyone can do love in the good times. Love is for standing in an unfinished kitchen and meaning it." The room was very quiet. Outside the ranch was coming to life, boots on gravel, a horse being led to water. Walt's voice somewhere in the distance. But in the kitchen, there was just the two of them, and what had just been said, which was not about the drought or the water rights or Hawthorne's deadline, but was also entirely about all of those things. "She would have had an opinion about this situation," Clara said. "She would have had several," Nathan said. And this time the almost smile came fully, briefly arrived and departed, but it was real. "What would she have said?" Clara asked. He looked at her, a long, honest look. "She would have said that I already know the right answer," he said. "She always thought I knew the right answer before I admitted it. She was usually correct." Clara held his gaze. "Do you," she said, "know it?" He opened his mouth. Walt's boots hit the back step, and the door opened, and the moment folded itself away. "Hawthorne will meet," Walt said, breathing like a man who had ridden faster than his age recommended. "Millhaven. This afternoon. 2 o'clock. Nathan stood immediately. The rancher was back, all the contained purpose of him, the decision already half made, in the set of his shoulders. "Saddle the gray," he said to Walt, "and tell Pete to handle the south fence today." He turned to Clara. "I'll be back before supper." "I'll keep it warm," she said. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Then he went. She didn't keep it warm. He wasn't back before supper. He wasn't back by 7. By 8 o'clock, the hands had eaten and dispersed, the kitchen was clean, and Clara was sitting at the table with her grandmother's journal open to a page she wasn't reading, listening for the sound of a horse on the road. At 8:30, Denny appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face told her before he spoke. "There's been trouble in Millhaven," he said. She closed the journal. "Tell me." "Mr. Calloway got to the meeting," Denny said. "But your uncle was there too, Roy Whitmore. He'd gotten to Hawthorne first apparently. Spent the morning there." He shifted his weight. "Roy told Hawthorne that you and Mr. Calloway were—" "I understand," Clara said. "Go on." "Hawthorne pulled the meeting. Said he wasn't prepared to do business with a man who was, his words, conducting himself inappropriately with his household staff. Roy had been working on him all morning." Denny looked miserable. "Mr. Calloway's still in Millhaven. Walt rode out to find him an hour ago." Clara stood up. "Thank you, Denny," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He stopped. "I'm sorry." "It's not your fault," she said. "Go to bed." She stood in the kitchen after he left and felt the cold come up through the floor. Roy had done it. He had found the one pressure point that could collapse everything, Not the legal challenge, not the gossip alone, but the strategic deployment of both at precisely the moment when Nathan was most vulnerable and Hawthorne was most skittish. And the combination of those two things could do maximum damage. Her uncle had never been smart about most things, but he was smart about destruction. He had a talent for it. She opened her grandmother's journal, not to a recipe this time, to the back pages. She read through the documentation again, slowly. Not panicking. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford, but thinking. Tracking the structure of what her grandmother had left her and how it might be used now in this specific situation, not just as defense against Roy's estate claim, but as something else. She stopped at the third document. The list of items Roy had sold without authority with dates and names. She read it again. Then she read it a third time. One of the names on the list was a Millhaven man, a merchant named Abbott who ran the second general store on the north end of town. Roy had sold him 3 pieces of furniture from her grandmother's house 18 months ago. Furniture that was specifically listed in the will as Clara's property, and the sale amount was recorded in her grandmother's careful hand, $14.50. $14.50 for items worth considerably more because Roy had needed the money fast and hadn't cared about the price. That sale was fraud, not civil fraud. Criminal fraud in the specific sense that Roy had knowingly sold property belonging to someone else. Clara sat with this for a long moment. Then she stood, opened the kitchen drawer where she kept a sheet of paper and a pencil for the supply lists, and began writing. Nathan came back at 10 o'clock. She heard the horse and was at the door before he reached it. He came through looking like a man who had ridden hard and thought harder and arrived somewhere he wasn't sure about. He stopped when he saw her face. "You heard," he said. "Denny told me," she said. "Sit down." He didn't argue. He sat. She put the sheet of paper in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" "My uncle committed criminal fraud," she said. "Not against me, against a Millhaven merchant named Abbott. He sold Abbott 3 pieces of furniture 18 months ago that legally belonged to me. My grandmother documented it, the date, the amount, the buyer's name." Nathan looked at the paper. "Roy Whitmore didn't just damage your meeting with Hawthorne today," Clara said. "He committed a crime in the same town where that meeting happened against a man who still lives there, and there is written documentation of it in my grandmother's handwriting." She sat down across from him. If that documentation were presented to the Millhaven sheriff tomorrow morning, Roy would have considerably more to think about than my grandmother's estate. Nathan looked at the paper for a long time. "You could have done this a week ago," he said. "I could have," she said. "I didn't because I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." "Why didn't you want it to come to this?" She met his eyes. "Because I didn't want the first useful thing I did here to be making trouble for someone else. Even Roy." She paused. "I came here to cook. I wanted that to be enough." Nathan looked at her steadily. "It was," he said. "It has been." And the way he said it quietly, without equivocation, told her that he meant it in all the ways it could be meant. "The meeting with Hawthorne," she said. "Can you get another one?" "Not after today," he said. "Roy poisoned that well completely. Hawthorne's pride won't allow him to reverse himself now, even if I proved everything Roy said was false." "Then we don't go to Hawthorne," Clara said. "We go to the sheriff." He looked at her. "Roy has to answer for what he did in Millhaven," she said. "Not for my sake, because it's the truth, and the truth is a more durable foundation than anything else we've got right now." She kept her voice steady. "When Roy is answering to the law, his credibility with Hawthorne is gone. And a man like Hawthorne, who is more concerned with appearances than he lets on, will recalculate." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking me to take this to the sheriff tomorrow morning," he said. "Before noon." "Before noon?" she said. "Yes." He looked at the paper. At her. "If this doesn't work," he said. "If Hawthorne transfers the water rights regardless, then we deal with that," she said. "But we deal with it having done the right thing, which is—" She stopped. which is the only way to deal with anything in my experience. He held her gaze for a long time. "Your grandmother taught you that," he said. "My grandmother lived it," she said. "Every day, even when it cost her." He picked up the paper. He folded it and put it in his breast pocket. "I'll be at the sheriff's office when it opens," he said. He stood, looked down at her. "Clara." "Yes, whatever happens tomorrow," he said. "I want you to know that the decision I've been working toward, the one about Hawthorne, about the arrangement, about what kind of man I intend to be going forward." He stopped, gathered it. "I made it, before today, before Roy Whitmore showed up and burned the meeting to the ground." He looked at her with the directness that was his most fundamental quality, stripped of everything else. "I made it in this kitchen, 3 nights ago, when you asked me how long I'd been making decisions based only on what was practical." Clara held very still. "I've been making them that way for 8 years, he said, "and I'm done with it." The kitchen held the silence of that. "Nathan," she said. Her voice was very steady. "Go deal with tomorrow. We'll talk about the rest when there's room for it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're managing me," he said. But the corner of his mouth moved. "I'm feeding this ranch," she said. "That's all I've ever done here." He put on his hat. He went. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her grandmother's journal and went through every page, not reading the recipes, she knew those by heart now, but reading the margins, the small notes, the fragments of a life lived carefully and recorded faithfully by a woman who had understood that the truth needs witnesses. There were things in those margins she hadn't noticed before. Small observations. "R came again today. I told him the will is signed and filed. He doesn't believe me, but believes the attorney, which is the same thing. And later Clara will know how to use what I've left her. She has her mother's steadiness and her grandfather's stubbornness. She'll be all right." Clara sat with that sentence for a long time. She'll be all right. Not she'll be happy, or she'll be safe, or she'll find someone to take care of her. Her grandmother had understood with the precision of a woman who had lived 80 years and paid attention during all of them, that all right was the foundation. That all right meant standing on your own ground, with the truth in your hands and the work in front of you. Everything else her grandmother seemed to have believed came from that. At 2 in the morning, Clara baked a pie. Not because she needed to, not because anyone would notice, or because the morning required it, or because it was Sunday. She baked it because the kitchen was cold, and she needed something to do with her hands while her mind ran over everything that would happen or not happen in Millhaven in 8 hours. She baked the blackberry pie. Page 37. Brown butter crust cardamom, the particular care her grandmother had built into every measurement. The smell of it filled the kitchen and moved through the quiet house. And something in her settled. Not because the pie would fix anything, but because the act of making it carefully the right way in the middle of the night when no one was watching, and there was nothing to prove, reminded her of who she was, and where she'd come from, and what the woman who had raised her had believed about the ordinary and extraordinary value of feeding people with love. She set the pie to cool. She sat down at the table. She folded her hands over her grandmother's journal. And she waited for morning, the way she had waited for every hard thing in her life, with her eyes open and her work done, and whatever came next, finding her ready. Walt woke her at 4. She had fallen asleep at the table. He put his hand on the kitchen doorframe and said her name quietly, and she was awake immediately in the way of people who have learned to sleep lightly. "Mr. Calloway's already saddled," Walt said. "He's riding out to Millhaven." She straightened in the chair. "Before the sheriff's office opens." "He said he'd wait," Walt said. "He said—" Walt paused. Something in his expression was different this morning. Something she might have called moved if she'd been confident that Walt Greer was the kind of man who moved. "He said to tell you he'd be back before noon, and that you should save him a piece of whatever that is." He was looking at the pie on the counter. Clara looked at it too. "Tell him it'll be here," she said. Walt nodded, started to go, stopped. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Walt." "For what it's worth," he said, slowly, carefully, the way a man chooses words he is not practiced at. "I've been on this ranch for 11 years. I've watched this place go from what it was when Ellen Calloway was alive to what it became after. And I've watched what you've done in the past 4 weeks." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've watched this ranch remember itself." Clara held very still. "It was worth saying," Walt said. "I've been meaning to for a while." He left. Clara sat alone in the kitchen as the sky began to lighten with the pie cooling on the counter, and the morning coming, and everything she had built in 4 weeks, sitting in the balance of the next 8 hours. And she felt something that was not hope and not fear, but something between them. The honest, awake, clear-eyed feeling of a person who has done everything right and is waiting to see if right is enough. She got up. She started breakfast. Because 40 men were going to be hungry. And whatever happened in Millhaven this morning, this ranch needed to be fed. The hands ate breakfast with the particular focused quiet of men who know something is happening that they are not part of, but that will affect them. Clara could feel it at the table, the way conversations stayed short, the way eyes cut toward the door and back, the way Denny poured his second coffee and then sat holding it without drinking it. They knew Nathan had ridden out before dawn. They knew something was being decided in Millhaven. Clara moved through the kitchen with the same rhythm she brought to every morning refilling. Clearing, managing the flow of 40 men and their appetites, and did not allow herself to watch the clock. Watching the clock was a way of giving time authority over her composure, and she had decided before the sun came up that she would not do that today. She had made her grandmother's biscuits. She had made the gravy and the eggs and the salt pork. She had set the pie on the far counter under a clean cloth where it would keep until noon. She had done the work. The rest was Nathan's to do. At 7:30, Pete Alderman appeared in the kitchen doorway, with his hat in his hands, and an expression that suggested he was carrying something. "There's a woman at the front gate," he said. "Arrived by buggy. She's asking for Mr. Calloway." Clara looked up. "Who is she?" Pete shifted his weight. "Victoria Hawthorne." The kitchen went a degree quieter. 2 of the hands at the far end of the table stopped talking. Clara set down the ladle. "Did she say what she wanted?" "She said she needs to speak to whoever is managing the house today," Pete said. Carefully, as if he understood that the phrasing of this mattered. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll go," she said. Victoria Hawthorne was not what Clara had assembled from the second-hand descriptions. Denny had said she made an impression, and Walt had responded with the word competent, the way a man deploys a word when he can't say what he actually observed. But standing at the front gate of Red Cedar Ranch in the morning light, Victoria Hawthorne looked less like an impression and more like a woman who had made a decision that cost her something and was carrying it with the particular upright stillness of someone who has decided not to let it show. She was 26, as Nathan had said. She was dressed for travel, not for a social call. Her hands were holding the reins of the buggy horse with the practiced ease of a woman who drove herself rather than being driven. She looked at Clara when she approached and did not perform pleasantness. "You're the cook," she said. Not unkindly, directly. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "Mr. Calloway is in Millhaven. He's expected back by noon." "I know he's in Millhaven," Victoria said. "I know why, too." She looked at Clara with an assessment that was more honest than hostile, the look of a woman taking a measurement. "May I come in?" Clara opened the gate. They went to the kitchen because that was where Clara was, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Victoria sat at the table without being invited, to which Clara noted was not rudeness, but habit. The habit of a woman accustomed to managing a household, and therefore accustomed to sitting in kitchens without ceremony. Clara put coffee in front of her. Victoria wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment. "My father doesn't know I'm here," she said. "All right," Clara said. "What my father arranged with Roy Whitmore yesterday." She stopped. pressed her lips together briefly. He believed he was acting in my interest. I want to be clear about that. He thought that removing an obstacle would help his position. And you, Clara said. Victoria looked up. I think a man who would ride out before dawn to stand up for someone in his household is not a man who is conducting himself inappropriately with that person, she said. I think my father was sold a lie by a man who needed to sell it. And I think... She stopped again. Something moved through her expression that was more honest than her careful phrasing. I think I've been arranged like a piece of furniture in my father's business plan for long enough to recognize when another woman is being arranged the same way. Clara looked at her for a moment. Why are you here? She said. Victoria set down her coffee mug. Because I'm going to tell my father to withdraw the deadline. The kitchen was very quiet. Why? Clara said. Because I don't want to marry a man who is in love with someone else, Victoria said, plainly, the way she seemed to do most things. And because it's the only honest move left. Clara felt the word land in love and held very still. Miss Hawthorne, she said carefully, whatever you believe about Mr. Calloway's feelings, I'm not discussing feelings, Victoria said. I'm discussing what I observed when I was in this kitchen 6 days ago. She looked around the room, not the walls, not the window, but at the structure of the space. At the order of it. At the jar of wildflowers someone had put in the corner of the windowsill that Clara had stopped noticing. At the pie under the cloth. At the precise, cared-for quality of a room that had been turned from a neglected workspace into something that functioned like a home. He came in to check the coffee pot, Victoria said. He didn't know I was still in the hall. He just came in to check whether there was coffee on. And the way he... She stopped. A man doesn't check the coffee pot in his own kitchen unless the kitchen means something to him that it didn't before. Clara said nothing. I went home and told my father I wasn't certain, Victoria said. He told me I'd change my mind. I haven't. She picked up her mug, drank, set it down. My father's deadline is a performance. The mining company offer is a leverage tool. It's real, but it's not as favorable as he's implied. He needs this merger more than Nathan Calloway does. She looked at Clara directly. You already knew that. I suspected, Clara said. You were right, Victoria said. I manage the household accounts. I know what we owe and to whom. My father is not in crisis, but he will be within 2 years if the ranch doesn't have a clear succession plan and a solid operating partner. She paused. What he needs is not a son-in-law. He needs a business arrangement with a neighboring ranch. Those are different things, and he has been conflating them because he thought I needed to be settled. Clara looked at her. And do you? Victoria almost smiled. I need to find a man who wants to marry me rather than my father's water rights, she said. That's a different project entirely, and one I intend to pursue on my own terms. She stood. I'm going home to have a conversation with my father that I should have had 3 weeks ago. By the time Nathan Calloway rides back from Millhaven, the deadline will be gone. She picked up her hat. Miss Whitmore, she said at the door. Yes. Victoria looked at her with the honest, even regard of a woman who has decided to do the harder right thing and has made her peace with it. I hope it works out, she said. For both of you. She went out. Clara stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of the buggy wheels on the road and felt something she was not quite prepared for gratitude for a woman she had just met, for the particular courage it takes to tell the truth when the truth doesn't benefit you. She went to the stove. She kept the coffee warm. She waited. Nathan came back at 11:40. She heard his horse and was at the counter when he came through the door, and she could tell from the first second from the way he moved from the set of his shoulders, from the quality of the silence he brought in with him, that something had shifted. He stopped in the middle of the kitchen. He looked at her. Roy's in custody, he said. Clara let out a slow breath. The sheriff took it seriously, Nathan said. He pulled out a chair and sat, the way a man sits when he has been carrying weight for several hours and has just set it down. Abbott confirmed the sale. Had the receipt. Roy didn't deny it. I think he didn't realize the documentation existed until the sheriff showed him your grandmother's record. He paused. He'll face a fraud charge. The estate counterclaim he filed will be dismissed once the attorney in Miles City files the opposing documents. When? Clara said. Within the week, Nathan said. Bert, your grandmother's attorney, he wired back this morning. He's filing the response today. Clara nodded, steadily. And Hawthorne? Nathan looked at her. Something in his expression was different, not just from this morning, but from any expression she had catalogued in 7 weeks. It was the expression of a man who had come back from somewhere with a decision already made and settled into his bones. Hawthorne sent a message to the sheriff's office while I was there, he said. His deadline is withdrawn. The water rights transfer is on hold pending a... He paused. Pending a renegotiation of terms. Clara set down the cloth she'd been holding. Victoria came here this morning, she said. Nathan went still. What? She sat at that table, Clara said. She told me she was going home to talk to her father. She said... Clara paused, chose honesty over caution because they were past the point where caution served anything. She said she didn't want to marry a man who was in love with someone else. Nathan looked at the table, at the exact spot where Victoria Hawthorne had sat, and said that. She's right, he said, quietly, directly. The kitchen held the silence of that. Clara turned back to the counter. Her hands moved to the cloth over the pie, and she lifted it, and she cut 2 pieces with the precision she brought to everything. She set one in front of him. She sat down across from him with the other. He looked at the pie, looked at her. You baked this last night, he said. Walt said there were lights in the kitchen at 2 a.m. I needed something to do with my hands, she said. He picked up the fork. He took a bite. She watched his face. It was not the same as the first night, that involuntary broken open expression of a man ambushed by grief. This was different. This was a man tasting something he had come to associate with the particular kitchen and the particular woman who made it, and the expression on his face was not loss. It was something that had been building for 7 weeks and had just been given permission to exist. He set the fork down. Clara, he said. Yes, I need to say some things, he said. I need you to let me say them without managing me. She looked at him. All right. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, looking at her with the full directness that was his most fundamental quality. No calculation, no management, no performance. I have been running this ranch for 8 years, as if the only thing it required of me was work, he said. And I was good at work. I was better at work than at most other things, and I told myself that was enough, that the ranch surviving was enough, that the men being paid and the cattle being healthy and the land being maintained was the sum total of what a man in my position owed to himself and everyone else. He paused. I was wrong. Clara held very still. This kitchen was a room nobody wanted to be in, he said. The men came through it the way you move through a space that serves a function and nothing more. I came through it that way too. He looked at the table. 7 weeks ago, a woman walked in with a battered suitcase and a recipe journal and made coffee that was worth drinking and biscuits that gave my men something to look forward to on a Friday. And she stayed up past midnight on her first night to clean a kitchen that hadn't been properly maintained in months. Not because anyone asked her to, but because it needed doing, and she was the one who could do it. He looked up. You changed this ranch, he said. Not the food. The food was part of it. But you changed the way this place felt about itself. And somewhere in there... He stopped. Took a breath. Somewhere in there, you changed the way I felt about things I had decided were finished. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She held his gaze. I'm not a romantic man, Nathan said. I don't have the vocabulary for it the way some men do. I can't tell you things in the way a younger man might or a more practiced one. He paused. What I can tell you is that I come to this kitchen every night because it's the only room on this ranch where I feel like myself. where I feel like the man I was before I decided that man was no longer necessary. Another pause. That has everything to do with you. The kitchen was so quiet she could hear the sound of horses somewhere in the yard, and the distant sound of men working, and the ordinary music of a ranch going about its day, indifferent to the particular weight of this moment. "Nathan," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. She pressed her lips together, waited. "I rejected the Hawthorne arrangement 3 days ago," he said. "In my own mind. Before Roy burned the meeting, before Victoria came here this morning, before any of today. I rejected it because I went to bed on Sunday night and lay there thinking about practical considerations and water rights and investor pressure, and what I kept coming back to, what I could not make stop mattering, was the way you looked at me the night I said Ellen's name." He swallowed. No one had looked at me that way in 8 years. Like I was still a person worth looking at honestly. Clara felt something press up against the inside of her chest. "I don't want to marry a woman who will manage this ranch efficiently," he said. "I want—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I want what I had before, and lost. And I was certain for a long time that wanting it again was a form of betrayal. Of Ellen. Of what we had." He looked at his hands, then up at her. "I don't believe that anymore." "When did you stop?" she said quietly. "Page 37, he said. She blinked. "You left the journal on the table one night," he said. "I shouldn't have read it, but it was open and the page your grandmother's note at the bottom." He held her gaze. For the ones who have forgotten, they deserve sweetness. He let that sit. "I haven't forgotten," he said. "I was just afraid that sweetness was something that happened to a person once." Clara's voice, when it came, was steady. "My grandmother would say," she said carefully, "that it happens as many times as a person is brave enough to let it." He looked at her. "Are you brave enough?" she said. "I don't know," he said. And it was the most honest thing she had heard from him, which, given what she had heard from him over 7 weeks, was a significant standard. "But I'd like to find out, if you're willing to find out alongside me." Clara looked at this man across the table, this controlled, disciplined, grieving, stubborn, honest man who had come to her kitchen every night for 7 weeks and drunk his coffee in the far corner and gradually moved closer in all the ways a person moves closer, and had just said everything that needed to be said without embellishment or performance. "I came to this ranch with $11.40 and my grandmother's recipes," she said. "I wasn't looking for anything except honest work." "I know," he said. "I found it," she said. "The work." "I know. I found some other things too," she said, "that I wasn't expecting." He waited. "I'm not a woman who says things she doesn't mean," she said, "and I'm not a woman who makes decisions based on what someone else thinks they should be." She met his eyes directly. "I'm also not a woman who wastes time being afraid of something she already knows the answer to." He held her gaze. "The answer is yes," he said. "The answer," she said, "is that I've been keeping coffee warm until 10 o'clock every night for 7 weeks for one specific person, and it wasn't because I thought he might be cold." Nathan Calloway looked at her across the kitchen table, with the blackberry pie between them and the ranch outside the window, and everything that had been and was now differently arranged, and he smiled. Not the ghost of a smile. Not the near thing. The real one. The whole of it arrived and present and entirely genuine, and it changed his face in a way that made Clara understand with a clarity that had nothing to do with sentiment exactly what Ellen Calloway had seen in this man all those years ago. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers. Neither of them said anything. Outside the ranch went on horses and cattle and the sound of men working in the afternoon heat. But in the kitchen, something that had been moving toward this for 7 weeks arrived quietly without drama, the way real things tend to arrive, not as a lightning strike, but as a light coming on in a room that has been dark a very long time. The afternoon brought its own work as afternoon always did, and the particular grace of that moment folded itself into the fabric of the day. The way all genuine moments do not disappearing, but becoming part of the foundation. Walt knew. Clara could tell from the way he came into the kitchen at 2 o'clock, saw Nathan sitting at the table finishing his second piece of pie, registered the quality of the room, and said nothing at all except, "The south fence is holding," which had nothing to do with the south fence. Nathan said, "Good," which also had nothing to do with the south fence. Walt poured himself coffee and went back out. Denny knew too. He appeared in the doorway at 3 with a question about the supply order and asked it with the careful neutrality of a young man who was very aware of the atmosphere in the room and very determined not to do anything that would alter it. By supper, the whole ranch knew because 40 men living and working in proximity develop a collective sensitivity to shifts in the social weather that would embarrass a professional meteorologist. Nobody said anything directly. But Friday Cobbler appeared on the table with an extra pan, which Clara had not planned, and Hank Morse, who had not smiled at supper in living memory, smiled at supper. Nathan ate with the men, not at a separate table. Not late in the kitchen, he sat at the long table with the hands and ate what everyone else ate and said little, but what he said was easy, and the ease of it was new. Tom Briggs noticed. Pete noticed. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway and noticed all of them noticing. The ranch, as Walt had said, was remembering itself. 3 days later, Harold Birch's response arrived from Miles City. It was thorough. It was unassailable. It contained a copy of Rose Whitmore's original will, a signed attestation from Birch himself regarding the authenticity of all documents, a formal response to Roy's counterclaim, and a covering letter that described Roy Whitmore's legal position in the kind of precise, impartial language that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Roy Whitmore had no claim. He never had. Nathan read the letter at the kitchen table and slid it across to Clara without comment. She read it. Felt the thing inside her chest that had been braced for 4 weeks release slowly like a fist opening. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," Nathan said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Roy will face the fraud charge in Cascade County Court," he said. "Birch recommends you appear as a witness, but given the documentation and Abbott's testimony, he doesn't anticipate that your presence will be required more than once." Clara nodded. She looked at the letter, at her grandmother's will reproduced in Birch's careful clerk's hand. "She protected me even after she was gone," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "She knew what she was doing when she left you that journal." "She knew everything she was doing," Clara said. "She always did." She folded the letter and set it on top of the journal. "She would have told me not to spend too long being grateful and to get back to work." "She sounds like someone I would have argued with," Nathan said. "She would have won," Clara said. "They usually do," he said. And the warmth in his voice, uncomplicated, natural, completely unmanaged, was a thing she was still adjusting to, still learning to receive without bracing against it. She went back to the stove. "Nathan," she said. "Yes?" "The Hawthorne situation," she said. "The water rights. The business partnership. I'm meeting with Charles Hawthorne on Monday," he said. "Not as prospective son-in-law, as neighboring rancher. Walt thinks we can negotiate a shared access agreement on the East River boundary without a marriage arrangement. Hawthorne's position is weaker than he let on, and he knows I know it now." "Victoria told him," Clara said. "Victoria told him," Nathan confirmed. "Apparently she told him quite a lot on the drive home. He's—" A pause. "Walt says Hawthorne sounded chastened on the wire. That's not a word Walt uses loosely." "No," Clara said. "It isn't. The water rights issue will take time to resolve properly," Nathan said. "The drought may take more out of this summer than I'd like. There may be decisions ahead that are hard." He paused. "I want you to know that I'm not asking anything of you based on what I think the ranch needs. What I'm asking what I said 3 days ago at this table that's separate from the ranch." Clara turned around. "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "You've gotten better at saying things." "I've had practice," he said. "Recent practice." She turned back to the stove and did not let him see the smile, which was not something she was ashamed of, but was also not something she felt like sharing with the whole kitchen just yet. The week that followed was not simple. Simple was not the natural condition of a working cattle ranch in a drought year, with a legal proceeding pending, and a water rights negotiation beginning, and 40 men whose livelihoods depended on decisions being made correctly. But it was different from the weeks before it. The difference was not in what was resolved. Most things were not yet resolved. It was in the quality of facing what wasn't resolved. The way Nathan came to the kitchen and laid problems on the table, and they worked through them together with coffee and her grandmother's journal, and the particular kind of thinking that happens between two people who have stopped performing for each other. The way Walt stopped delivering information to Nathan and then separately updating Clara, and started addressing both of them at the same time, which was an efficiency that no one discussed but everyone recognized. The way the ranch slowly and without announcement reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. Tom Briggs told Denny one evening, when they thought Clara was out of earshot, that the ranch felt the way it had the year Mrs. Calloway was alive. Denny said he wouldn't know, he'd only come on 5 years ago. Tom said, "Trust me, it felt like this." Denny said that must have been something. Tom said, "It was." Clara heard all of it from the pantry and did not come out until she was certain her face was suitable for company. On the following Sunday, she baked the blackberry pie. Nathan was at the table when she took it out, reading through paperwork from the Miles City attorney. He looked up when the smell reached him and set the papers down with the uncomplicated reflexiveness of a man whose body had learned to respond to that smell as something worth stopping for. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she confirmed. She set it on the counter to cool. He watched her work for a moment. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said, not sharp, warm. "Let it cool first." He almost smiled. "I was going to say something else." She turned. "Then say it." He looked at her across the kitchen, across the 7 weeks of evenings, and the coffee kept warm, and the bread, and the conversations, and the pie, and everything it had meant accumulating without either of them naming it until it was large enough to be undeniable. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as the cook, not as the woman who manages the kitchen and the stores and makes the men remember they're worth feeding." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay as the person this ranch makes sense to me with." Clara looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. And what was in his eyes was not the controlled, managed expression she had catalogued that first night in the doorway. It was open, fully without apology. He lifted his hand and touched her face, the knuckle of his finger against her cheek, briefly, gently, with the particular tenderness of a man who has not allowed himself to touch anything gently in a very long time and is relearning the skill. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she said. "For walking through my gate with nothing and making it into something worth having again." Clara reached up and covered his hand with hers. "My grandmother would say you did the same for me," she said. He looked at her. "The pie's cooling," she said softly. "I know," he said. He didn't move. Neither did she. Outside the kitchen, Red Cedar Ranch went on in the afternoon, horses and cattle, and the sound of men who had been fed well and treated with dignity going about their work with something that had not been there 8 weeks ago. Something that could not be measured in acres or head of cattle or water rights or the bottom line of a season's accounting. The kitchen that had been a room nobody wanted to be in held 2 people who were exactly where they intended to be, and on the counter the blackberry pie cooled slowly in the Sunday afternoon air. Still warm at the center, the way good things are. The Monday meeting with Charles Hawthorne lasted 4 hours. Nathan came back at 6 in the evening, later than expected, And Clara had kept supper warm with the specific patience of a woman who has learned that the most important things rarely resolve on schedule. She heard his horse, heard him hand it off to Pete, heard his boots cross the yard with a deliberateness that told her nothing conclusive and everything simultaneously. He came through the kitchen door. She looked at his face. She let out a breath. "The East River access," she said. Not a question. "Shared use agreement," he said. 10-year term. Annual fee indexed to cattle prices. No marriage condition. He sat down at the table. Hawthorne wanted to shake hands and pretend the last 3 weeks hadn't happened. I let him. "That was generous," Clara said. "It was practical," Nathan said. Then he paused. Victoria was there. Clara looked up. "She sat through the whole meeting," he said. Didn't say much. But at the end, when her father went to get the paperwork, she looked at me and said, "I hope you know what you have." He held Clara's gaze. I told her I was beginning to understand it. Clara set a plate in front of him. He reached across and took her hand briefly before picking up his fork. Just briefly. The way people touch when touching has become the natural punctuation of a thing between them. "Hawthorne asked about you," Nathan said. "What did he ask?" "He asked if the cook was still at the ranch." Nathan looked at her. I told him the cook was the reason the ranch was still standing, and that I intended to make sure she stayed. Clara sat down across from him. "That's a considerable amount of credit for biscuits and blackberry pie." "The biscuits," Nathan said with the tone of a man making a point, "were exceptional. The pie changed my life. I stand by the characterization." She looked at him for a moment. The directness of him. The warmth that had come back into him like water returning to a dry creek after rain, not all at once but steadily, reliably filling in the spaces that had been empty. "Eat your supper," she said. He smiled. The real one, the whole of it. He ate. August moved towards September with the particular momentum of a season that has decided to resolve itself. The drought broke on a Wednesday, 12 days after the Hawthorne agreement was signed. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical violence of a plains thunderstorm, but with a steady, purposeful rain that lasted 2 days and replenished what the summer had taken with the quiet efficiency of something long overdue. The hands stood in the yard on the first morning and turned their faces up to it, and Clara watched from the kitchen window and felt something inside her chest ease that she hadn't realized was still braced. The south herd didn't need to be sold. The east pasture recovered within the week. Nathan walked the north fence line on the 3rd day after the rain and came back with mud on his boots and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not relief, which implies the fear was larger than the outcome, but something quieter and more durable. Satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of a man who has weathered a hard thing and come out the other side with what mattered still intact. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table and said nothing for a full minute. Then, "We're going to be all right." Clara looked up from the bread she was shaping. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew before I did." "I knew the rain would come," she said. "Droughts end. That's what they do." "I wasn't talking about the rain," he said. She met his eyes. "I know," she said again softer. He got up and poured his own coffee, something he had started doing 2 weeks ago, the way a man makes himself at home in a kitchen that has become his. In a different way than it was before, and stood at the counter beside her while she worked close enough that their arms nearly touched, and they were quiet together, with the rain still pattering on the roof, and the bread dough under her hands, and the coffee steaming between them. It was, Clara thought, the most ordinary, extraordinary moment she had ever been in. Roy Whitmore's hearing was held in Cascade County on the 2nd Thursday of September. Harold Birch had been correct. Clara's presence was required only once to affirm the documentation and answer 3 questions from the judge that took less than 10 minutes. Roy sat across the room in the borrowed suit of a man who had run out of performances, and for the first time in her life, Clara looked at him without bracing. He looked smaller than she remembered. He looked like what he had always been, underneath the bluster and the strategy, a man who had spent his life taking things from people smaller than him and calling it his right. He did not look at her. The judge reviewed the documentation, reviewed Abbott's testimony, reviewed Harold Birch's attestation regarding the will and the fraudulent counterclaim. It took 40 minutes. Roy Whitmore was found guilty of fraudulent sale of property belonging to another and ordered to pay restitution to Abbott and to Clara the full assessed value of the furniture plus costs, and was formally barred from any further claim against the estate of Rose Whitmore. The counterclaim was dismissed with prejudice. Clara sat in the hard wooden chair of the Cascade County courtroom and heard the judge's ruling and felt not triumph, not the hot satisfaction of revenge, something much quieter, something that had her grandmother's name on it. It was done. The thing Rose Whitmore had spent the last years of her life carefully building a defense against was done. Her granddaughter was standing on solid ground with clean title to what had been left her, and Roy Whitmore had nothing left to threaten with. Clara walked out of the courthouse into the September morning and stopped on the steps. Nathan was standing at the bottom of them. He had driven her himself and waited outside because she had asked him to. She had needed to walk into that room as herself alone, the way her grandmother had taught her to walk into hard things. He looked up at her. She nodded once. He came up the steps and stood beside her. "Well," he said. "It's over?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "Like I can put it down," she said. "Like I've been carrying it for a long time and I can set it down now and walk away from it." He looked at her. "What will you do with the orchard property?" "Keep it," she said. "For now. And see." She paused. "My grandmother planted those trees herself. I'd like to go back someday and see if they're still producing." "We could go," he said. "After the season settles. Take the wagon and—" He stopped himself. She looked at him. "I'm making plans on your behalf," he said. "I do that. I've noticed I do that." "I've noticed too," she said. "Does it bother you?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man on the courthouse steps in the September morning, who had ridden with her to Cascade County because she needed to do this alone, and had understood exactly what that meant without her having to explain it. "Nathan," she said, "I walked through your gate 2 months ago with $11.40. "I know," he said. "I'm not the same person who walked through that gate," she said. "I don't mean that in a sad way. I mean it the way my grandmother meant things." She held his gaze. "I mean it as the best possible version of the truth." He looked at her steadily. "Make all the plans you want," she said. He reached over and took her hand. They walked down the steps together. The harvest celebration was Nathan's idea. He announced it at supper on a Friday in late September. With the directness he brought to everything, stood at the head of the long table and told 40 men that Red Cedar Ranch was hosting a harvest gathering for every hand, every neighboring family, and anyone else who had stood by the ranch through a difficult summer, and that it would take place in 2 weeks on a Saturday, and that Mrs. Dawson from the neighboring spread had already agreed to help with the music. A beat of silence. Then Hank Morse, who had smiled at supper exactly once in living memory, said, "Are we getting the cobbler?" The table erupted. Nathan looked at Clara standing in the kitchen doorway. She looked back at him. "There will be cobbler," she said, "and pie." The sound that went up from 40 working men was disproportionate to the occasion and entirely appropriate to what it actually meant, which was that this ranch had come back to itself and everyone at that table knew it. Clara went back to the stove. She was already planning the menu. The 2 weeks before the celebration were the most purely joyful work Clara had ever done in a kitchen. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. Feeding a harvest celebration for 80-odd people across a full afternoon required the kind of logistical planning that would have occupied a military quartermaster, and Clara approached it with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She made lists. She assessed the stores. She brought in extra supplies from Millhaven, and she drove herself because she had earned the right to drive herself, and because Morrison's General Store had long since stopped being a place where she felt observed rather than simply present. Walt helped. More precisely, Walt did exactly what she told him and asked no questions about why, which was the most helpful version of Walt available. Denny helped too, with the particular wholehearted willingness of a young man who had decided that Clara Whitmore was the most competent person he had ever encountered, and that assisting her in any capacity was an honor worth taking seriously. Tom Briggs built an extra table. Pete Alderman brought wildflowers from the south pasture in a bucket without explanation and set them on the kitchen counter where the other jar of wildflowers had been, and went back to work without saying a word about it. Hank Morse, on the Thursday before the celebration, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a crate of the best blackberries Clara had ever seen. She stared at them. "North Ridge," Hank said. "They come in every fall. Previous cook didn't know about them." He set the crate on the counter. "Thought you should." She looked at him. "Hank," she said, "these are perfect." He shrugged. The shrug of a 61-year-old man who is pleased and has no intention of admitting it. "They're blackberries," he said. "They do what they do." He went back to work. Clara stood in the kitchen with a crate of North Ridge blackberries and thought about her grandmother, who had believed that the best ingredients come to you when you've built the kind of place that deserves them. She opened her grandmother's journal to page 37. She had memorized the recipe long ago. She looked at it anyway. For the ones who have forgotten, they deserve sweetness. She closed the journal. She got to work. So, the Saturday of the harvest celebration arrived with the specific generosity of a September day that has decided to be its best self. By 9 in the morning, the yard of Red Cedar Ranch was filling with people, neighboring families arriving in wagons, ranch hands, in their cleaned-up clothes, looking unfamiliar to each other and pleased about it, children running in directions that served no strategic purpose and needed none. Mrs. Dawson and her husband set up their fiddle and banjo near the east barn before noon, and by 1 o'clock, there was music moving through the air above the crowd, like something the day had decided to add for free. Clara did not stop moving from sunrise to mid-afternoon. She had organized the kitchen like a campaign, what came out when, who was handling which station, how the temperature of the food would be managed across a 3-hour serving window. Walt ran the outdoor fire. Denny managed the bread. 3 of the neighboring women who had offered to help found within 20 minutes of arriving that working alongside Clara Whitmore was both instructive and completely without friction, because she gave clear direction, took none of the credit, and made the work feel like something worth doing. The food went out in waves, the stews and the roasted meat first, the bread, the vegetables she'd been preserving since July brought up from the cellar and presented in a way that made several of the neighboring wives ask her in the course of the afternoon how she'd done it. She told them, plainly, completely, without keeping anything back. Her grandmother had told her that a recipe shared is a recipe that survives. At 3 o'clock, Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway. The yard behind him was full of people eating and talking and listening to the music, and the sound of it came in around him, warm and layered and alive. He looked at Clara across the busy kitchen, and the look on his face, past the noise, past the work, past everything that was happening around them, was the specific look of a man seeing exactly what he intended to see. "Come outside," he said. "I have pies in the oven," she said. "Walt can watch them," he said. Walt has never watched a pie in his life. "Walt," Nathan said, raising his voice, "can you watch the pies?" Walt appeared from the far end of the kitchen. "I can watch the pies," he said with the dignity of a man accepting a command. "He cannot watch the pies," Clara said. "Miss Whitmore," Walt said, drawing himself up. "I have managed the operations of a working cattle ranch for 11 years. I believe I can manage a pie." Clara looked at him. 7 minutes, she said. "The moment you smell browning crust, pull them." 7 minutes. Browning crust, Walt said. "Go." Nathan took her hand, and they went outside into the September afternoon, into the noise and the music, and the gathered community of a ranch that had remembered what it was for. And Clara let herself be in it, fully, not managing it, not producing it, not standing in a doorway, watching from a careful distance. In it. Tom Briggs was dancing with his wife near the barn. Pete had two small children attached to his legs who appeared to be under the impression that he was a large and useful piece of furniture. Hank Morse was sitting with a group of older men talking with the comfortable authority of a man whose opinions have been earned over decades. Denny was near the food table looking pleased with himself in a way that suggested he had just been complimented by one of the neighboring women and was not sure what to do about it. Mrs. Dawson's fiddle was playing something that insisted on being happy. Nathan stood beside Clara, with her hand in his, and watched the ranch he had built with the look of a man who has gotten something back that he thought was permanently gone and understood in this specific moment the full weight of what that means. "You did this," he said quietly. "We did this," she said. "Clara." "This is what a ranch does," she said, "when the people in it feel like they matter to someone." He turned to look at her. "Walt's going to burn the pies," he said. "Walt is not going to burn the pies," she said. "He's more capable than he lets on." "Like someone else I know," he said. She looked at him. He reached into his jacket pocket. She didn't understand what he was doing. For a moment, he was looking at her with such directness that she didn't register his hand moving. Then he was holding something, and she looked down, and it was a ring. Simple. Gold. Not ostentatious. Nothing about Nathan Calloway was ever ostentatious but solid and well-made, and chosen with the same care he brought to everything that mattered. The music was still playing. The yard was still full of people. Neither of them existed in that moment in any significant way. "I told you I'm not a romantic man," Nathan said. His voice was steady and low and entirely real. "And I told you I don't have the vocabulary some men have, so I'm going to say it plainly." He held the ring and held her gaze. "You walked into a kitchen that had stopped being a home and made it into one again. You walked into a life that had stopped feeling like mine and made me feel like myself again." A pause. "I don't want to do any of this without you. Not the ranch, not the mornings, not the supper table, not the Sunday pie." He held the ring out. "Clara Ann Whitmore, will you marry me?" The fiddle played. The September air sat warm around them. Clara looked at this man, this difficult, honest, guarded, generous, irreplaceable man who had spent 8 years building walls and 4 months watching her work and 7 weeks coming to her kitchen and saying in all the ways a person says things without words, "I am still here. I am still capable of this." You did not arrive too late. She felt her grandmother's journal in the kitchen. She felt the weight of it not physically, but in the way you feel the presence of someone you love across the distance of death, warm and specific and real. She felt $11.40 in a coat pocket on a road to a gate she'd never been through before. She felt every meal she had made, and every morning she had gotten up and done the work, and every night she had kept the coffee warm, and every page of a recipe journal written by a woman who had known maybe that it was all moving toward something. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. The fiddle stopped, not because anyone told it to, but because Mrs. Dawson had been watching with the eagle-eyed attention of a woman who does not miss things, and she had chosen this moment to retune a string, which meant the fiddle stopped and then started again, and the first note of the new song was louder than the last, and several people looked up. Tom Briggs saw first. He put his fingers in his mouth and whistled. That was all it took. The yard responded the way 40 people respond when they have been waiting for something to be official that they have known for weeks was true, not with surprise, but with the specific joy of confirmation. Hank Morse stood up. Pete tried to stand up and had to detach 2 children first. Denny dropped something. Walt appeared in the kitchen doorway with both pies intact, held one in each hand, looked at Nathan, and Clara looked at the ring, and said with the gravity of a man making a formal announcement, "The pies are done." "Thank you, Walt," Clara said, laughing. 7 minutes, Walt said. "Exactly." He went back inside. Nathan was looking at her with the real smile the whole of it arrived, and staying belonging entirely to this moment, and this woman, and this life he had decided to start living again. "The cobbler," Clara said. "We have to serve the cobbler." "In a minute," he said. "Nathan." "Clara," he said. The cobbler can wait 60 seconds. She looked at him. He pulled her close, pulled her. And in the middle of the harvest celebration for Red Cedar Ranch, surrounded by the community of people who had watched this place come back to itself over the course of one hard, surprising, grace-filled summer, Nathan Calloway held the woman he loved with the simple, uncomplicated certainty of a man who has finally stopped running from the best thing in his life. 60 seconds. Then they served the cobbler. 1 year later, Red Cedar Ranch was not the richest operation in Montana Territory. It was something considerably better than that. The water rights agreement with Hawthorne held through the winter and was renewed in the spring with improved terms because Victoria had taken over management of the Hawthorne accounts by December, and she negotiated with the precision of a woman who had been doing it unofficially for years and saw no reason to be modest about her competence now that it was official. She and Clara corresponded by letter monthly, a correspondence that had begun as practical and become something warmer, which surprised neither of them as much as it probably should have. The South herd came through the winter in the best condition the ranch had seen in 5 years. Walt credited the improved feed management. Nathan credited the water access. The hands credited the fact that morale had been high enough through the fall that people were doing their work with something other than minimum effort. Clara credited her grandmother's apple butter, which she had started making in October, and which had, according to Hank Morse, restructured his entire understanding of what a winter morning could be. The kitchen remained the kitchen. It was still the warmest room on the ranch, and still the room where things got said that needed saying, and still the room where Walt came to deliver information to the two people who now managed Red Cedar Ranch together, not as employer and employee, not even entirely as husband and wife in the formal sense of divided responsibilities, but as two people who had each brought a particular and complementary quality to every problem that came through the door. Nathan brought the land sense, the financial discipline, the relentless competence of a man who had been doing this for 20 years. Clara brought everything else. She brought the understanding of people that comes from spending years feeding them and listening to them and treating their hunger, not just physical, as something worth addressing. She brought the practical intelligence that her grandmother had cultivated in her across a lifetime of doing things right in difficult circumstances. She brought the recipe journal, which had become over the course of one extraordinary summer, the most consulted document on the ranch, not only for recipes, but for the particular kind of wisdom that lives in the margins of a life lived with attention and love. And she brought the Sunday pie. Every Sunday, without fail, Clara baked the blackberry pie from page 37. Not because it reminded Nathan of Ellen. That was not why, and he had said so clearly and without ambiguity on a Sunday evening in October when she had asked him directly, because she was a woman who believed in asking directly. "It doesn't remind me of the past," he said. He was sitting at the table with his coffee and the ranch accounts and the specific settled quality he carried, now that had replaced the controlled tension she had first catalogued in a man standing in a kitchen doorway, expecting to find it empty. "It's not about what was. It's about what is." He looked at her. "It's the smell of Sunday in this kitchen, with you." She had turned back to the oven before he could see her face. She baked the pie the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. She would bake it every Sunday for the rest of her life. In the late spring of the following year, Harold Birch sent a final letter from Miles City. The restitution from Roy Whitmore had been collected in installments because Roy Whitmore was not a man who had ever accumulated enough resources to pay anything in full at once, and the last payment had arrived. The estate of Rose Whitmore was fully and finally settled. The orchard property in Miles City was in Clara's name, clear title, no encumbrances. And Birch, who was 80 years old, and had been practicing law in Montana Territory since before it was called that, added a postscript in his old man's careful hand. "Your grandmother came to me 31 years ago and told me she intended to build something that would outlast her. She built it for you. I hope it has served its purpose. H.B." Clara read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Nathan was out on the north pasture and the ranch was going about its day around her. She read it twice. Then she opened the recipe journal to the first page. "To Clara, who will cook with love when I no longer can. Grandma Rose." She sat with it for a long time. In June, she and Nathan took the wagon to Miles City. The orchard was still there. The trees were old, but producing the kind of old growth that has decided to outlast everything else, and has the root system to back up the decision. The blackberries along the south fence had gone untended and were magnificent for it, sprawling in the particular abundance of something given complete freedom and no reason to hold back. Nathan walked the property with his hands in his pockets and the appraising eye of a man who sees land in terms of what it's doing and what it could do, and Clara walked beside him and felt something she did not have an immediate word for. Then she had the word, home, not instead of Red Cedar Ranch. Alongside it. The home she had come from, and the home she had made, both real, both hers, connected by a recipe journal, and a woman who had believed without ever saying it directly, that love does not diminish when you give it generously, it multiplies. "We could plant more trees," Nathan said. He was standing at the fence line looking at the orchard. "The south section hasn't been touched in years. The soil's good." "We could," Clara said. "It would take time to establish a proper yield." "Yes," she said. "It would." He looked at her. Worth it. She looked at the orchard, at the old trees, at the blackberries spilling over the fence with the uncomplicated abundance of things that have been allowed to simply grow. "My grandmother planted the original trees 20 years before they produced anything worth harvesting," Clara said. She said she wasn't planting them for herself. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Who was she planting them for? Clara looked at him. "Whoever came next," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence of her grandmother's orchard in the June morning, and looked at what had been left to them, and what they would leave in turn, and neither of them needed to say what both of them knew. They were going to plant more trees. Dad. The annual harvest celebration at Red Cedar Ranch became, over the following years, the event on the territorial social calendar that people traveled actual distances to attend. Not because it was lavish, it wasn't. Nathan Calloway had no interest in spectacle. But there was something about the gathering at Red Cedar Ranch that people who had been once came back to, and people who had heard about it made a point of getting themselves invited to, and the reason when anyone tried to articulate it came down to the same thing every time. It felt like somewhere that remembered what people are for. Hank Morse, at the celebration in the second year, said this to Walt Greer, with the authority of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the genuine article when he encounters it. Walt said, "It's the pie." Hank said, "It's not just the pie." Walt said, "I know it's not just the pie." They were quiet for a moment. "But the pie," Hank said, "is exceptional." Walt raised his cup. They drank to it. Cool. On a Sunday evening in the early fall, 2 years after a woman with $11.40 had walked through the gate of Red Cedar Ranch and changed everything, Nathan Calloway stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his wife take a pie from the oven. The kitchen smelled the way it smelled every Sunday. The way it would smell he understood now every Sunday for the rest of his life. A smell that had stopped carrying grief somewhere in the first winter, and had become instead the smell of what his life actually was, in all its ordinary, extraordinary, irreplaceable particulars. Clara set the pie on the counter to cool. She turned and saw him in the doorway. "You're early," she said. "I finished the fence line early," he said. He came into the kitchen, stood beside her, looked at the pie the way a man looks at something that has become, over years of repetition, the most certain and beloved thing in his life. "It smells like Sunday," he said. "It is Sunday," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "I mean, it smells like every Sunday." She understood what he meant. She took his hand. He turned to face her fully. This man who had spent 8 years trying to be adequate to the absence of love, and had spent the last 2 years learning what it meant to be adequate to its presence, and he said something he did not plan. "I used to think that losing Ellen meant I'd used up whatever portion of happiness a person gets," he said, "that the account was closed, that whatever came after was just management." He looked at their joined hands. I was wrong about that." "Yes," she said quietly. "You were." "It took a blackberry pie to tell me," he said. "It took more than that," she said. "It did," he said. "But the pie was the beginning." She looked at him for a long, full moment, the whole of him, the man she had come to know from the inside out. The way you know a kitchen you have worked in every day until it is as familiar as your own hands. "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "Let it cool first," she said. He laughed. The real one. The whole of it present and unguarded and entirely his, filling the kitchen, the way warmth fills a room when someone finally opens the flue and lets the fire do what fires are made to do. They waited for the pie to cool in the Sunday kitchen of a ranch that had found its way back to itself, built on honest work and stubborn decency, and the daily deliberate radical act of feeding people as if they matter, because they do. Because they always did, and because a woman with nothing but a recipe journal and her grandmother's belief in the transforming power of a meal made with love had walked through a gate one summer morning and refused to let anyone in that kitchen forget it. The pie cooled. They ate it together. And Red Cedar Ranch, which had once been the loneliest place in Montana Territory, became the happiest, not because the hard things stopped coming, but because the people inside it had learned once and for all that love is not something you spend until it runs out. Love is something you bake again every Sunday and serve to whoever sits down at your table. And it never not once tastes the same as the last time, because the last time was then, and this time is now, and now with the right person beside you, and your grandmother's recipe in your hands. And a kitchen full of the smell of something made with care is always, without exception, enough.